Winterfell's walls rose stark against the slate-gray sky, their once proud towers burned and battered. Snow dusted the rubble and the wind whistled through gaps in the stone, sounding like the soft sighs of a wounded beast. At the courtyard's edge, near the largest breach, Robb Stark stood with his mother, Catelyn. The king in the north was clad in fur-lined leathers, his hair stirring in the cold breeze, gray wind at his side. Men scurried around them, hauling timbers to prop up half-collapsed walls, digging out shattered masonry, or clearing debris from what had been the old kitchens. Robb's brow furrowed with grim resolve. "It will take years to restore Winterfell," he said softly. "But it will be done. It must be." Catelyn nodded, her eyes roaming over the courtyard. Every time she looked upon the wreckage, she felt a wrenching twist of sorrow, memories of Sansa dancing in the yard, of Arya sparring with wooden swords, of Bran scaling the walls. Now the keep was half-skeletal, its courtyard stripped bare. "Perhaps the gods allowed this ruin to remind us how fragile we are," she murmured. "Yet we endure. That's what matters." Close by, two of the Greyjoy's men hammered beams into place near the gatehouse. A large portion of the gatehouse roof had caved in, leaving debris strewn across the yard. Midge Mormont stood with them, directing the work in a brusque voice. "Get that timber upright. No, not that angle, you dolt." Her daughters, Daisy and Alicent, joined in, lending their strength. The Mormonts prided themselves on being as tough as any man, and the sight of them hoisting beams made that evident. On the opposite side, several umbers from last hearth lugged stones into a pile that might become a new outer wall. The Greyjoy himself had stalked off to inspect the old stables, cursing at the damage done by Theon Greyjoy's men. Bits of charred wood and blackened posts told the tale of how the Ironborn torched everything when they realized they could not hold Winterfell. When the day's labor came to an end, torches lit the Great Hall, what was left of it. While the ceiling still partially stood, many portions had caved in and were now open to the cold. Repairs had begun there too, with wooden scaffolding erected to keep the damaged walls from collapsing fully. Heavy curtains had been hung to ward off the worst of the wind. The men gathered to eat a humble meal, warm pottages, black bread, salt fish from White Harbor's supplies, and watered ale. There was no feast, no lavish spread. This was a time of rebuilding, not celebration. Yet the atmosphere was not entirely grim. There was laughter at some of the tables, rough jokes shared by men who took heart from being home in the north at last. The direwolf banner draping the cracked stone wall reminded them that House Stark remained unbroken, no matter the ruin. Robb ate with his mother near a brazier that gave some precious heat. Grey Wind dozed at his feet, ears twitching. Off to the side, the Greyjoy and Midge Mormont exchanged boasts about who had killed more Ironborn in the retaking of Moat Cailin. Catelyn noticed the fatigue in every face. Yet there was also that deeper glimmer of hope, the sense that, after everything, the Red Wedding, the betrayal at Harrenhal, the battles in the Riverlands, they had reclaimed their seat. Brynden Tully, who had stayed behind at Riverrun, had sent word that Tywin's forces, broken outside Riverrun, were regrouping slowly in the Westerlands. The realm was not at peace, but neither was there an immediate threat of a southern army crossing the neck. Meanwhile, the sudden death of Balon Greyjoy had drawn the Ironborn back to their isles to engage in the brutal squabbles of a Kingsmoot. That left the north relatively free of new raiding forces, though scattered pockets of Ironborn lingered on the stony shore. The greatest uncertainty lay in Roose Bolton, the traitor who had vanished after losing Harrenhal. No new sightings had been reported, yet his silence boded ill. In the north, a silent enemy was often more dangerous than an open one. After the meal, Catelyn followed Robb up the cracked steps to the Old Solar. Parts of the corridor were blocked by rubble. They picked their way carefully, torches held high. The stone floors felt chill beneath their boots, a reminder that the famous hot spring heating channels beneath Winterfell had been damaged in the sacking. At last, they reached a chamber that had been partially cleared of debris. It had once been Ned Stark's solar, tapestries of hunts, old books and maps, the seat where he'd administered northern justice. Much of that was gone or ruined by smoke and fire. Only the bare walls and a single sturdy table remained. They lit fresh lanterns. Robb unrolled a map across the table, an old, slightly tattered chart of the north. Inked upon it were the coastlines, mountains, and roads, with major seats marked: Winterfell, White Harbor, Deepwood Motte, Torrhen Square, Bear Island, the Dreadfort. So many strongholds that had once sworn fealty to House Stark. Catelyn eyed the Dreadfort's location and recalled Roose Bolton's cruelty. Robb dragged a fingertip across the region around the Dreadfort. If Bolton yet lives, he'll try to return here, gather whatever strength remains. but our scouts say no sign of him. His bastard, Ramsay Snow, was rumored to have done horrific things at Winterfell, but he vanished too. If they're alive, they're likely in hiding." She nodded. "Roose is cunning, not one to make a bold stand unless certain of victory. He knows Tywin is reeling, so perhaps he'll wait to see if a southern alliance can help him. He might also try to slip back north to rally the lesser houses that once swore to him. Or he might rely on stealth, picking off our outriders." Robb tapped Moat Cailin on the map. "We hold the gateway to the north, so he can't easily approach from the south, unless he crosses the White Knife near White Harbor, which is loyal to us, or attempts some crossing from the east. For now, we remain vigilant." He studied the coastline. The Ironborn still squat in pockets along the stony shore. Lady Meage's scouts reported a handful of reavers refusing to depart. "They're leaderless but dangerous. We'll need to root them out eventually." Catelyn exhaled, absorbing the weight of these tasks. "We cannot do it all at once, Robb. The men are tired, your forces scattered between Harrenhal, the Twins, Riverrun, and here, and winter grows deeper by the day." His gaze flicked to her, tempered by all the trials he had endured. "I know, Mother, but the realm won't pause simply because we're weary. We'll do what we can, step by step." A rap sounded at the broken door. One of the Manderly knights, Ser Marlon Manderly, stooped his head through. "Your Grace, we've a visitor at the gates, a crannogman from the Neck. Says he bears word from Lord Howland Reed." Robb's expression brightened slightly. "Show him in." Before long, a short, lithe figure in mottled green and brown leathers approached, escorted by 2 Stark guards. His face was half hidden by a cowl. Mud streaked his legs. He bowed deeply to Robb and Catelyn. "I am Raffel Lintgreave, sworn to Greywater Watch. I bring greetings from Lord Reed." Catelyn had rarely seen Howland Reed since the war began. A loyal bannerman of the Starks, he seldom left his floating fortress, Greywater Watch. "What news does he send?" Raffel looked around at the damaged solar, the shadows flickering across the walls. "Lord Reed commends the king in the north for retaking Moat Cailin. He also offers help if needed to rid the last Ironborn from the bogs near the Fever River." He paused. "And he asks whether any sign of your young ones has emerged." "He's been searching." Catelyn's heart clenched. "He still hunts for Bran and Rickon?" "Aye, my lady. Lord Reed's crannogmen have prowled the swamps, asked travelers on the causeways. Word says the boys fled Winterfell with Hodder, Osha, and a Reed lad or lass, Jojen or Mira. No one has seen them. We fear they went north, possibly beyond the wall." "Beyond the wall?" Robb blurted. "Why?" The crannogman shrugged lightly. "Some rumors say they sought refuge with your brother on the wall or thought to find safety among wildlings. All uncertain. Lord Reed begs the king in the north not to give up. If they live, he will help find them. If you wish, he can send more scouts." Catelyn's mouth felt dry. The notion that her younger sons were lost beyond the wall chilled her more than the winter wind. Then again, it seemed less dreadful than believing them dead. She forced her voice steady. "Tell Lord Reed we are grateful. We do not give up hope." Robb nodded, more measured now. "Yes, give him our thanks. And if he has men to spare, we welcome them. We must ensure no Ironborn retake Moat Cailin, nor do any traitors slip through." Raffel dipped his head. "I shall depart at first light. Good fortune, your grace, my lady." With that, he slipped out quietly as he had come. In the silence that followed, Robb exhaled. "Bran and Rickon beyond the wall. I can scarcely fathom it. We can't spare an army to send north of the wall. The Night's Watch might," he broke off, expression grim. "But they have their own troubles." Catelyn remembered talk of wildlings stirring under a new king beyond the wall, some Mance raider, and rumors of fell creatures in the far north. Even Ned had never fully believed in legends of the others. But the men of the Watch whispered that winter would bring darker terrors. "We can't be everywhere, Robb. At least we know Lord Reed is searching, and perhaps your brothers found safe haven among friends. We must trust in that." He nodded solemnly. "Come. Let's see if we can salvage any more from Father's old chests. Then we'll rest. Tomorrow we plan the next step. How to rid the coastline of Ironborn and confirm our hold." They turned back to rummaging carefully among the scorched remains of Ned's solar. Beneath a half-burned table, they discovered a small iron-bound chest that had survived the flames. Inside lay a few notes in Ned's familiar handwriting, and a tarnished silver pin shaped like a direwolf's head. Catelyn cupped it gently in her palm, her eyes wet, a piece of Ned's memory reclaimed amid the ashes. Dawn arrived cold and clear. Ravens perched on the highest stubs of Winterfell's towers, cawing to greet the pale sun. In the courtyard, Midge Mormont's daughters were already up, sparring with wooden staves, their breath steaming in the chill air. Nearby, the Great John supervised a group of archers practicing at straw targets. The ring of hammered steel floated across the yard as blacksmiths began forging nails and hinges for the repairs. A sense of purpose wove through the ruin. They were Starks and Northmen, and they would not let devastation stand unchallenged. Robb called a small council in the partially repaired Great Hall, where braziers glowed. Attending were the Great John, Midge Mormont, Ser Wendell Manderly, representing his father, Lord Wyman, and a handful of knights from lesser houses. Catelyn stood at Robb's side, hands clasped. A map of the North had been pinned to a wooden partition, well lit by lanterns. "We've retaken Moat Cailin and hold the central roads," Robb began. "The question is, how do we proceed? The Ironborn who remain along the stony shore might regroup if we leave them alone. White Harbor begs for relief shipments to help the hungry. The Dreadfort stands silent, yet we can't ignore Bolton's threat. And we've only so many men. I want your counsel." Midge Mormont crossed her arms over her broad chest. "My daughters and I can lead a force along the coast, burning out any Ironborn hideouts. The Bear Island folk know these waters. We'll root them out quickly." The Great John bared his teeth in a fierce grin. "I drive the squid lovers into the sea." Then he sobered. "But what of Bolton? If Roose or his bastards slip back in, we need to be ready to crush them. I say we send outriders around the Dreadfort, see if it's guarded." Ser Wendell Manderly rubbed his chin. "White Harbor's men can help watch the eastern roads, your grace. My father can dispatch more knights to keep an eye on the Dreadfort, too. But we're stretched thin in winter, and the seas are rough." Robb considered each suggestion, arms folded. "We must be decisive. Lady Midge, take a few hundred men along the stony shore, whatever you deem necessary, and uproot every Ironborn nest you find. The rest of the host will remain here at Winterfell for now, focusing on repairs and security. But I'll also send scouts toward the Dreadfort. We can't let Roose or Ramsay reappear unchallenged." Midge nodded. "Done. I'll leave in 3 days with those who volunteer." She shot a glance at the Great John. "Come on, Umber. You want to bash more skulls or not?" He let out a booming laugh. "I'll lend some Umbers, but I'll stay with the king. I like seeing these walls rise again, and if Bolton shows up, I want to be the first to greet him." Robb smirked faintly. "So be it. Ser Wendell, send a raven to your father. Tell him we're grateful for any watchers near the Dreadfort or the eastern passes. Let him know that once we secure the roads, I'll make time to visit White Harbor." They covered a few other points: the distribution of ration stores, the forging of new arms, the scheduling of hunts to find game in the Wolfswood. Winter's grip was tightening, game would grow scarce, but the Northmen were accustomed to hardship. The meeting ended with a sense of momentum, though overshadowed by the knowledge that victory was never final while the realm remained in chaos. After, Catelyn found her son in the courtyard, speaking quietly to some of the older men who had survived the Ironborn occupation. An old kennel master was describing how the dogs had fared, rummaging for scraps amid the ruins. Another villager recounted hidden cellars that might still hold salted meats. Robb listened intently, then thanked them before heading to the battered remnants of the Godwood, gray wind padding behind. She followed him. The Godwood lay largely intact, thanks to the hot springs that had deterred much of the fire. Steam drifted around the pale trunks of soldier pines. The great heart tree stood at the center, its carved face weeping red sap into a quiet pool. The air felt warmer here. Robb knelt by the water's edge, gray wind sniffing around the roots. Catelyn lowered herself beside him, hearing the trickle of water echo in the hush. For a time, neither spoke. Birds chirped in the canopy. Eventually, Robb whispered, "I feel Father's spirit here, Mother. More than I ever did in the Riverlands." She reached for his hand, gave it a gentle squeeze. "Your father loved this place." "Aye." He gazed at the face in the weirwood, expression troubled. "Sometimes I wonder if I measure up to him, if I'm honorable enough, strong enough. He would have guided the North differently. Maybe fewer men would have died." Catelyn's voice trembled with emotion. "He was a good man, Robb, but you are forging your own path, one he would be proud of. Look what you've achieved. Walder Frey's treachery undone, Tywin broken at Riverrun, Moat Cailin reclaimed. It's more than I dared hope when we lost him in King's Landing. A ghost of a smile touched Robb's lips. If only we could rescue Arya, Sansa, and find Bran and Rickon. Then I might breathe easier. Caitlyn's heart ached. I pray every day that the gods bring them home. Until then, we hold Winterfell, we do what we must. He nodded, rising to his feet, the quiet resolve in his eyes reminiscent of Ned's. Yes, we must protect the North from any threat, and perhaps that will help us find the others. They walked back through the Godswood in contemplative silence, gray wind trotting between them. The sense of unity in that space renewed their strength. Whatever horrors the realm still harbored, Bolton's guile, Tywin's thirst for vengeance, the Ironborn's raids, or the murky politics in King's Landing, the Starks would not yield. Their very presence in the ruined castle was a testament to that. 3 days later, Meage Mormont departed Winterfell at dawn with 200 warriors, half from Bear Island, half from Umbers and assorted loyal houses. They aimed for the stony shore, determined to clear out the last Ironborn footholds. A swirl of snow greeted their departure. Catelyn stood on the ramparts with Robb, watching them ride out, the clash of arms and stamping hooves echoing in the gatehouse passage. The day drifted into routine tasks. Repairs on the Great Hall roof, sorting out which storehouses still held grain, dispatching ravens to lords across the north. By mid-afternoon, a new arrival appeared, a knight wearing the sigil of House Glover. He came from Deepwood Motte, bringing reports that a few Ironborn ships still prowled the coast, but many had sailed home for the Kingsmoot. The Glover man also carried news that Stannis Baratheon was rumored to be at the Wall, forging some alliance with the Night's Watch against wildlings. The swirl of events beyond the north felt endless. In the evening, Catelyn made her way to the half-repaired library tower, where volunteers had begun gathering whatever books survived. She paused outside the tower, hearing voices within, quiet talk. Stepping through the doorway, she saw a lamplit scene. Several men and women kneeling among toppled shelves, gently stacking books. Most were singed or water-damaged, pages curled. A slender man in half-clerical robes oversaw them, a septon from White Harbor, assigned to help preserve Winterfell's knowledge. He looked up, nodding politely. "My Lady Stark, I'm afraid the library is in poor shape, but we've saved some genealogies, a few volumes of Northern history, and these." He gestured to a small table where half a dozen tomes lay open. Catelyn picked one up. It was a compendium of the First Men's lore, faint traces of Ned's handwriting in the margins. She smiled sadly, recalling how Ned would read these old stories to the children on cold nights, or how Bran used to pore over maps of the North. So much had changed, yet these fragments endured, like seeds waiting for spring. "Thank you," she told the Septon. "Any knowledge we reclaim is a victory." He bowed, returning to his careful sorting. She drifted among the broken shelves, stepping over scattered parchment and collapsed beams. Outside, the wind moaned, rattling the battered shutters. Winterfell's library had once been a trove of old scrolls and histories dating back to the Age of Heroes. Now it was a ragged skeleton. Still, the North survived in these pages. A faint clatter came from the stairs, and she turned to see Robb entering. He gave her a faint smile. "I heard you were here. Thought I'd join you." She set aside a mildewed volume of House Stark lineages. "It's strange to recall simpler days, when you and your siblings read all those tales of knights and heroes." He glanced around, picking up a half-burned book. "We learned about the White Walkers, the Long Night, Brandon the Builder. Back then, the dangers felt distant, mythical. Now, our every day is a battle." She squeezed his hand gently. "Let's salvage what we can, for future generations." The idea of a future beyond war lingered in the air. They spent the next hour helping the Septon and volunteers sort through debris. They carted away fragments, placed salvageable tomes in crates lined with straw. By the time they finished, night had fully fallen, the library lit only by flickering lanterns. On their way back to the Great Hall, mother and son paused in a corridor near the crypt entrance, hearing a low moan. Robb gestured to a guard who raised a torch, revealing a figure. Slumped against the wall, an older man in patched clothes, trembling. At once Catelyn recognized him as Farlan, once the kennel master under Ned's stewardship. He'd survived the sack, apparently, though wounded. They knelt by him. "Farlan," Robb said gently, "are you ill?" The old man coughed, wiping his nose. My lord, I'm sorry. Just old bones? I was looking for my dogs. They keep running off. The pups are half wild now." Catelyn beckoned to a guard. "Help him to the keep's infirmary. Get him warm. We'll find his dogs in the morning." Her tone softened. "Don't fret, Farlan. You'll see them again soon." He nodded weakly, tears glinting in his eyes. The guard supported him away, leaving Catelyn and Robb alone in the drafty corridor. Even small tasks, like caring for the kennel master, reminded them of the cost this war demanded from ordinary folk. Another swirl of guilt and determination flashed in Robb's gaze. They returned to the great hall, the brazier fires low, a hush settled over the battered space. Men already lay rolled in cloaks on the floor or along bench seats, trying to sleep. Catelyn parted ways with her son at the dais, each heading to their respective quarters, rudimentary chambers at best, but at least partially roofed. She climbed to her room, lay on a pallet with thin blankets. The wind pressed through every crack, and she pulled the cloak tighter. Sleep would be fitful, as it often was. Her dreams would drift between the memory of Ned's embrace and the future's uncertain promise. At dawn, horns sounded from the walls, distant and hollow in the frosty air. Catelyn, half-dressed, hurried to the courtyard to see what commotion stirred. Robb was already there with the Great John as a band of riders poured through the battered gates. The man at their head wore a tabard embroidered with a white harbor lighthouse, a Manderly knight. Beside him rode a second figure in dark leathers, bearing no distinct sigil that Catelyn recognized. They reined in, breath steaming in the cold. The Manderly knight swung down and saluted Robb. "Your Grace, I've come from White Harbor. We bring urgent news." Robb gestured for him to speak. Winterfell's gates had no time for ceremony. "What news?" The knight removed his helm, revealing a careworn face. "A merchant cog arrived from King's Landing, or near enough. Rumor from the south says King Joffrey is dead." A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. Catelyn's eyes widened. Joffrey Baratheon, if one could call him that, dead? The boy king who had ordered Ned's execution in King's Landing? "Are you certain?" Robb demanded. "How did he die?" "Poison, they say, at his own wedding feast. Or so the rumors go. The details are scattered, but the wedding was to Margaery Tyrell. Some claim Tyrion Lannister was arrested for the deed. Others say Lady Olenna Tyrell orchestrated it. The city is in chaos, so the reports are muddled." The second rider, the man in dark leathers, cleared his throat. "It's said that Tywin Lannister remains Hand of the King, and Tommen Baratheon is being crowned next. Many fear war might break out anew in the south." Catelyn's stomach twisted with conflicting emotions. Joffrey had caused so much suffering. His cruelty led to Ned's beheading. Part of her felt a grim satisfaction at his demise, but she also feared the ramifications. Tywin would not relinquish power. The realm's turmoil might worsen, or the Tyrells might seize advantage. "What of Sansa?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My daughter was betrothed to him once." The Manderly knight grimaced. "I heard no certain word. Some say she vanished the night of the wedding. Others claim the Lannisters hold her still. The truth is uncertain." Robb's jaw clenched. "We must find out. If there's a chance Sansa escaped," the Great John let out a rumbling breath. Robb nodded, turning back to the knight. "Your arrival is timely. Stay, rest, and give me every detail you have. We'll decide our next move after we hear all you know." As the riders dismounted, stable hands approached to tend their horses. Men pressed in, murmuring about Joffrey's death, some crossing themselves in superstitious dread, others cackling in triumph. Catelyn felt a swirl of relief, sorrow, and renewed anxiety. Another piece of the puzzle shifted. The Lannisters might lash out, or the Tyrells might claim a bigger share of power. Sansa's fate hung in the balance. She caught Robb's eye. Her son's expression was distant, as though grappling with how this news changed the game. He might have triumphed here in the north, but King's Landing remained a vortex of shifting alliances. She thought of Tyrion Lannister, who had once shown her a modicum of courtesy despite their differences. Now he stood accused of regicide. If the Lannisters devoured themselves from within, how would that shape the war? And would it present an opening for House Stark to recover their lost daughters? She laid a hand on Robb's arm. "We'll face this as we have everything else, step by step." He gave a curt nod, turning to order the Manderley Knight escorted inside for a proper briefing. The yard buzzed like a disturbed hive. News from King's Landing always sent ripples. But Joffrey's death was more than a ripple. It was a tidal wave. And from the vantage of a half-ruined castle in the north, House Stark once more stood at a crossroads. That afternoon, after gleaning every rumor from the travelers, Robb convened another gathering in the Great Hall. The usual faces attended. The Great John, Ser Wendell Manderley, the new arrivals, a few lesser knights. Catelyn stood by the dais. A hush lay over the men as Robb spelled out the known facts. "Joffrey is dead at his wedding feast," he said, voice echoing in the half-repaired hall. Whether Tyrion Lannister truly poisoned him or was framed remains uncertain. Tommen Baratheon, another child of the incest between Cersei and Jaime, if rumors are true, will be crowned next. Tywin Lannister is still the real power. The Tyrells remain in alliance, though it's rumored Margaery is quickly to be wed to the new boy king. One of the older knights spat. "A mess of vipers, all of them." Robb's gaze swept the room. "We have to decide how to respond. In the past, we sought a diplomatic solution to free my sisters, but Joffrey refused. Now that he's gone, perhaps we can negotiate with Tommen or the Tyrells. Or we wait. The Lannisters might become more desperate. War in the south could reopen." The Great John shrugged. "We hold the north now, keep it sealed. Let them kill each other in the south. Why not let Tywin wear himself out?" Ser Wendell Manderley frowned. "But if your sister Sansa is lost in the chaos, how do we save her if we don't intervene? And if the Lannisters unify behind a new boy king, they might strike again to re-establish power." Catelyn cleared her throat. "We must not forget that they still hold King's Landing. Tommen is under Tywin's thumb. The Tyrells want to secure their position. Perhaps Lady Olenna arranged Joffrey's death, as rumor says. Then the Tyrells might be the real threat. But if we stay completely aloof, we lose any chance of finding Sansa, or forging alliances that could end this war." An uneasy silence followed. No easy answers. The North had enough battles to fight. Rebuilding Winterfell, defending against Bolton, ousting the last Ironborn. Yet the Starks' southern entanglements mattered if they ever hoped to rescue Sansa or keep Tywin from marching north again. Robb inhaled slowly. "We'll see if we can send an envoy, perhaps to Mace Tyrell or even the new King's Council. Demand Sansa's release, maybe a hostage exchange. That said, I won't yield our sovereignty. We're king in the north, and that remains non-negotiable." Some men nodded fervently, proud of their independence. Others looked wary, well aware that Tywin seldom forgave or forgot. But no one voiced dissent. The meeting concluded with orders to draft letters, gather more intelligence, and remain on guard for any Lannister attempt to recover from the blow at Riverrun. As the gathering dispersed, Catelyn drifted aside with Robb, seeing the lines of fatigue in his face. "Do you truly think the Tyrells might be open to a truce?" she asked. He shrugged. Frost gilded every blade of grass, every splinter of broken timber. The wells sometimes froze at night, requiring men to break ice to fill buckets. Supplies were rationed carefully to ensure no one starved before the next shipments arrived from White Harbor or the villages that had begun to muster allegiance again. Late one afternoon, Catelyn oversaw the measuring of grain in a half-collapsed storehouse. Snow drifted through the open roof, landing in her hair. She directed a pair of men to stack sacks in rows, marking each with a tally on a scrap of parchment. They were nearly finished when a frantic voice echoed down the yard. "Riders, riders at the east gate. They carry the banner of the flayed man." The storehouse workers froze. Catelyn's stomach lurched. Bolton men openly approaching Winterfell? She dropped her parchment and ran out into the yard, heedless of the cold. The Great John was already bounding forth, sword half-drawn. Guards scurried to the walls. Robb appeared from the Great Hall, a cross-expression on his face as he called for men to arm themselves. Catelyn rushed to join her son. "What do we know?" she demanded of a sentry. "Not much, my lady. A small party, 10 riders, maybe, carrying a white banner alongside the flayed man. They say they come in peace." A shiver of revulsion tore through her. "Let them approach, but keep them at the gate. If it's a trap," Robb nodded, gesturing for archers to man the walls. "We'll meet them in the courtyard. I want crossbows trained on them from every angle." The gate chains rattled and the drawbridge, still under repair, was lowered enough for the riders to enter. They clopped into the yard under a tense hush. Snow swirled around them. Each wore the pale pink cloak of House Bolton, though the man at their head had no helm, his gaunt face exposed. Scars ran down his cheeks. He dismounted slowly, hands raised, showing no weapon. "I seek the king in the north," he declared, voice echoing. "In the name of Lord Roose Bolton." Robb stepped forward, flanked by the Great John and half a dozen swords. Grey Wind appeared behind them, lip curling in a silent snarl. "I am the king in the north. Speak quickly." The Bolton envoy inclined his head as if greeting a friend rather than an enemy. "My lord requests parley. He wishes to end hostilities between House Bolton and House Stark to reaffirm loyalty if certain conditions are met." A roar of outrage tore from the Greyjohn's throat. "He dares." Several onlookers shouted curses, remembering how Bolton had nearly betrayed them at the Red Wedding, how he abandoned Harrenhal. Crossbows bristled from the walls, aimed at the envoy. Catelyn could feel Robb's fury as a tangible force in the icy air. "Roose Bolton murdered many good Northmen. He conspired with Walder Frey to slaughter my retinue. He slunk away from Harrenhal like a thief. Now he begs for peace." The envoy kept his face carefully neutral. He regrets the misunderstandings. He was misled by Lord Walder. He did not partake in that attempt at the twins. If you grant him safe passage, he will come personally to Winterfell to kneel and offer fealty once more. "Lies," spat the Great John. "Let me gut him, your grace." Robb held up a staying hand, though rage darkened his features. He stared at the envoy. If Bolton truly wishes to bend the knee, let him come unarmed, alone, and accept judgment for his crimes. No negotiations. Full surrender. That is my offer. If he refuses, we hunt him down. Tell him that. A flicker of discomfort crossed the envoy's face. "My lord is a proud man, your grace. He demands certain concessions, keeping the Drevfort, ensuring House Bolton's lineage, no concessions," Robb snapped. "He has one chance to come here unarmed and face justice. If he won't, let him rot in the shadows. You have my answer." The envoy's jaw tightened. "Then you leave us no choice. My lord shall do what he must." Catelyn stiffened, bracing for a sudden attack. But the Bolton men seemed outnumbered and had no illusions. The envoy turned sharply on his heel, remounted, and led his riders out, his cloak flapping in the wind. They retreated through the gate, accompanied by jeers from the Northmen on the walls. Silence fell once the hoofbeats receded. Robb exhaled. Bolton's reached out. He must be desperate. Or he's planning a trap. The Great John barked a laugh. "Let him be desperate. He'll get no mercy from me." Catelyn frowned. "Roose is cunning. If he truly wants to come in person, it might be an excuse to get close. But if we refuse him entirely, he may ally with Tywin or even the Ironborn." Robb set his jaw. "Let him. We've no reason to trust him. We hold the North's strong points. If he tries to strike at us, we'll crush him, or we'll force him into an even more desperate alliance, one that Tywin might not be able to honor while the South is in chaos." The crowd dispersed, muttering about Bolton's gall. Some half expected a midnight assault. But none came. The watchers on the walls saw no sign of the flayed man's banners in the night. Instead, winter's stillness enveloped the charred towers, with only the wind moaning across the fields of snow. Yet Bolton's approach and the knowledge he lurked somewhere cast a fresh pall over Winterfell's daily life. Archers patrolled the ramparts, wary of infiltration. Hunting parties were escorted by armed guards. Robb doubled the watch at Moat Cailin in case Bolton tried to slip around the castle. Tension coiled like a drawn bowstring. Meanwhile, Tywin Lannister's next move remained a mystery, with the fiasco in King's Landing overshadowing all. In the gloom of an early twilight, Catelyn found Robb again in Ned's ruined solar, where he paced by a brazier that gave more shadows than light. Grey Wind hovered in a corner, eyes reflecting the flicker of flames. A scattering of parchments lay on the table. Letters from Brynden at Riverrun, from Lady Meage along the coast, from White Harbor. Each told of slow reconstruction, uncertain rumors from the south, or minor skirmishes with Ironborn stragglers. But none addressed the true fear in their hearts. Roose Bolton. "Is it wise to give him no quarter?" Catelyn asked quietly. "He's cornered, and cornered animals may lash out." Robb rubbed his temples. "He has no quarter from me. Not after Harrenhal, not after his involvement with Frey. But..." He stared into the brazier, acknowledging the point. "We can't let him join with Tywin or the Greyjoys. Yet I won't reward his treachery with a castle or a pardon. Best if we keep him at bay until we can gather enough men to crush him." A thunderous knock at the door made them both jump. The Great John barged in, his breath fogging in the chill. "Your Grace, word from the watchers at the King's Road. They saw Bolton riders heading south. Maybe a score of them." Robb frowned, exchanging a glance with Catelyn. "Running to Tywin, no doubt." The Great John shrugged. "Or to the Dread Fort to muster men. Hard to say. They're out of arrow range, not engaging. Should we pursue?" Robb considered a moment. "No, not yet. They're likely scouts or messengers. We can't spare a full cavalry chase in these snows. Let them go. If Bolton wants to scurry to the Lannisters, so be it. We'll be ready for both." The Great John nodded, though frustration etched his face. "If you change your mind, say the word. We'll run them down." He left, leaving the Solar in silence again. Catelyn exhaled. "We can't fight a war on every front." "Exactly, so we hold. If Bolton tries a southern gambit, Tywin might not have resources to help him. He's dealing with King's Landing's chaos, Joffrey's death, and the Tyrells. That leaves Bolton alone. Perhaps it's better for us." She moved closer, sensing his exhaustion. "Rest, Robb. You can't solve all this tonight." He nodded, stepping away from the brazier. "Aye. Perhaps we can't solve anything until the snows ease or the realm reveals its next turn. Good night, Mother." She watched him go, worry gnawing at her. There was no single foe to topple, but a web of intrigues. Tywin, Bolton, the uncertain fate of Sansa and Arya, the missing younger boys. The final shape of the war remained elusive. She offered a silent prayer to the old gods that they might see House Stark through whatever new treacheries lay beyond the walls. Over the next weeks, the pattern held. Winterfell's slow repairs, expansions of farmland near the castle to feed the garrison, hunts in the Wolfswood for deer or boar. The Manderley Knights rode back and forth, ferrying messages to White Harbor. Some travelers arrived from the mountains north of the Dreadfort, telling stories of figures glimpsed on lonely roads, perhaps Bolton men. Nothing definitive. The castle stood vigilant. Every so often, a rumor from the south arrived. Talk of Tyrion Lannister's trial, of Tywin's manipulations, of the Tyrells jockeying for favor. One tale claimed Sansa Stark had been spirited away by a mysterious knight during Joffrey's murder fiasco. Another insisted she was in the Red Keep. Contradictory whispers circulated with no solid proof. Catelyn's heart yearned for clarity but found none. A bitter midwinter storm struck one morning, piling drifts of snow against the half-repaired walls. Work slowed as men huddled indoors for warmth. Snow kept falling, thick and relentless. By afternoon, the yard was a white sea. Soldiers trudged about, clearing essential pathways, while the Great John bellowed curses at the sky. Catelyn retreated to the Great Hall, warming herself by a roaring fire, surrounded by men dozing or whittling to pass the time. Amid that hush, a distant horn sounded. At first, none believed it possible. No one should be traveling in such weather. But the horn blew again, sharper. A scout rushed in, shouting that a band of riders approached under direwolf banners. That roused everyone. Robb hurried out back, coning whomever was within reach. Archers took up position, though the direwolf banner was presumably friendly. The gates creaked open to admit riders heavily cloaked in furs hunched against the storm. Their horses snorted steam into the freezing air. At their head was a slight figure in a hooded cloak, face mostly concealed by snow and fur. Beside that figure rode Midge Mormont, her distinctive broad shoulders instantly recognizable. Catelyn's breath caught. Midge had been on the coast. Who was this person with her? They halted in the courtyard, dismounting stiffly, and Midge let out a hearty laugh as she saw Robb. "My king, I bring you a gift from the sea." She gestured to the cloaked figure. "Go on, girl, show him your face." The figure pushed back the hood and revealed a young woman with tangled brown hair, streaked by salt and wind. Her cheeks were ruddy from the cold, her eyes large and bright with alarm and relief. Catelyn's breath froze. "Arya?" she gasped. But no, this girl was older, with a narrower face. She studied the features carefully. The young woman drew in a breath, voice trembling. "My name is Asha Greyjoy. Lady Mormont seized my longship near the Bay of Ice after we parted ways with Euron's raiders. She told me I'd be brought to the king in the north. She swallowed. So here I am." Murmurs of confusion rippled. Asha Greyjoy, the daughter of Balan, a commander of Ironborn Reavers. She had fought against the North. Catelyn saw Robb's eyes flare with anger, though he kept his composure. "Why do you come here?" he demanded. "Why not remain among your Irefolk?" Asha shrugged under her wet furs. "My father's dead. My uncle Euron claims the Seastone chair, but many Ireborn want me to stand for the Kingsmoot. I refused or tried. They turned on me. My men scattered. Lady Mormont caught me on the shore. She spared my life, said I might parley with you. I have no illusions about my position. If you'd rather take my head, get on with it." Catelyn glimpsed a haunted determination in Asha's eyes. This was no cowering prisoner. Meej Mormont stomped forward. "She didn't put up much of a fight once cornered. Said she's done with the Ironborn ways. We lost a few men subduing her warriors. But in the end, she yielded to me in exchange for safe passage." Robb's fury simmered, but he reined it in. "You attacked the North. You burned our villages, seized our castles. Now you waltz in expecting mercy." Asha's face twisted with regret and defiance. "I did, and I lost a brother, Theon, in all this madness. My father sent him to take Winterfell. Look what that wrought. I'm no friend to the Red Kraken or my Crow's Eye uncle. If you want me dead, do it. If you want me as a hostage to ensure my people stay away, I might be worth that. But if you'll hear me, I offer a different path." The courtyard fell silent except for the wind. The Greyjoy's hand twitched at his sword hilt. Men watched for Robb's reaction. Catelyn's mind spun. Asha Greyjoy, apparently cast aside by her own kin, returning as a captive, offering what? Perhaps an end to Ironborn raids if she somehow gained influence. It seemed improbable, but the realm's shifts had proven anything was possible. Robb's gaze was ice. "Speak." Asha steeled herself. "You want the Ironborn out of the North, yes? They're nearly gone, but pockets remain. With me as your hostage or guest, let's say, I can send ravens to those still loyal to me, urging them to leave or submit. We could end the last of the raiding, let you rebuild your home in peace. In return, you grant me my life. Perhaps you even let me sail south eventually. I want no part in Euron's Kingsmoot." Murmurs rose. Some demanded her head for the crimes. Others saw a glimmer of advantage. Robb's face remained a storm cloud of conflicting thoughts. At last, he said, "I'll consider your offer. For now, you're my prisoner. You'll stay under guard." Asha nodded, tension sagging from her shoulders. "Fair enough, King Stark. 'Tis more than I expected." Meej pounded Asha's shoulder. "She fought well, your grace. A better swordswoman than some men. But she gave up once cornered. Said she's no love for Euron or the Iron Throne." Meej paused. "I thought you'd want to speak with her yourself. See if it helps rid us of the squids for good." Robb narrowed his eyes. "You did well, Lady Meej, but keep her guarded day and night." He beckoned to a cluster of men. "Take her inside. Have the maester see to her bruises, but chain her if need be. Then we'll talk." Asha held his gaze, neither pleading nor defiant. "Understood. I'm at your mercy." The guards led her away, the courtyard parting in hushed amazement. An Ironborn princess or close to it, within the walls she helped ravage. Catelyn watched them go, a knot of unease forming in her gut. Another twist in this war. An offer from Balon Greyjoy's daughter, disclaiming her family's cruelty, possibly seeking a fresh start. Could the North truly find peace with the Ironborn through her? Or was it another ploy? She turned to Meej. "You traveled far, my lady. Rest. We'll speak more once you've warmed up." Meej nodded, expression as stony as Bear Island's shores. I've tales to tell of Euron's cunning. But for now, I need a meal that doesn't taste of salt and blood." Robb dismissed the men, telling them to stable the horses, stow gear, and gather for updates. The snow continued falling, swirling in gusts. Soon the courtyard was empty but for drifting flakes and the footprints of those who had come inside. Winter's hush lay thick over the battered ramparts, broken only by the distant call of crows. That night, the great hall buzzed with talk of Asha Greyjoy. Many men scorned her as a raider's whelp, fit only for the headsman's block. Others saw a chance to rid themselves of Ironborn stragglers. Around the central brazier, Meej recounted how she'd cornered Asha on a rocky strand near the Bay of Ice, battered her men into submission, and recognized her skill. "She's no craven," Meej admitted grudgingly, "but she's cunning." Robb listened, face unreadable, occasionally nodding. When asked what he planned to do, he only said, "I'll speak with her more tomorrow." Then he rose, ending the discussion. Catelyn watched him go, shoulders rigid with tension, gray wind shadowing him. She could guess the war of thoughts behind his silent facade. Morning came bleak and cold, wind rattling what shutters remained. Snow coated the yard ankle-deep. Robb summoned Asha Greyjoy to a small audience in the Old Solar, where a brazier gave meager warmth. Guards escorted her in. She had washed some of the salt from her hair, though bruises still darkened her cheek. They'd bound her wrists, albeit loosely so she could move. Catelyn stood off to the side, with Meej Mormont and the Great John present, arms folded. For guards lined the walls, crossbows ready should Asha attempt treachery. Gray wind lay at Robb's feet, baring teeth in a silent warning. Robb fixed Asha with a piercing stare. "Explain again. You claim to want no part in the Iron Isle's new Kingsmoot, or in continuing your father's war. Why should I believe you?" She met his gaze steadily. "Because I've lost everything to that war. My father's dead, Theon's fate unknown, my men scattered. The Ironborn refused to yield, and look what it earned them, ruin. Now Euron crows I struts in, promising glory in far-off seas. I have no taste for it. Let the old fools chase his madness." Catelyn watched, trying to read sincerity or guile in the Greyjoy woman's face. Asha had the look of a proud warrior forced into a corner. "And what do you offer the North in exchange for your life?" she asked quietly. Asha's jaw tightened. "The Ironborn left on the North shores might heed me if I tell them to stand down or to sail home. Not all, but some. And if you let me live, keep me as a hostage if you must, we might negotiate a permanent peace. The Isles are in chaos, some want to sign on with Euron, others fear him. If I have any chance to gather loyal men, it's only if I still draw breath." The Great John snorted. "Sounds like a worthless bargain. The Ironborn never keep their word." Asha shot him a fierce glare. "There's truth in that. We reave and raid. But I speak for myself and for those once loyal to my father who questioned Euron. Give me a chance, I'll prove it." Robb leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "I remember the burning of Winterfell. The Ironborn under Theon took my home. You say you lost a brother. I lost 2, maybe 4 children of my house, Bran, Rickon missing, Sansa captive in the south, Arya vanished. Why would I spare you?" A flicker of pain crossed Asha's features. "My brother's actions were not mine. But yes, I carry the guilt because we share the same father. Theon was always chasing father's approval, hungry for a prize. It's cost him dearly. If he yet lives, I doubt we'll ever mend that rift. I can't undo what he did, but I can help end any further bloodshed." Robb studied her for a long moment. Silence coiled. Outside, wind whistled. At last, he said, "I'll not simply trust your word, but I see potential in halting these raids. This war can't go on forever." The Great John scowled but did not interrupt. Meej Mormont rubbed her chin. "If she can get the Ironborn to leave for good, it's worth something, lad, your grace." Robb straightened. "All right, Asha Greyjoy. You remain my prisoner. I'll keep you here in Winterfell guarded. You'll write letters to any of your father's captains who might heed you, urging them to depart or surrender. If any do so, we'll see your words ring true. If you attempt treachery, or if we catch you working against us, I'll see you dead." "Agreed." Asha exhaled slowly, nodding. "Agreed, King Stark." He gestured, and the guards approached to unbind her wrists. "Take her to a secure chamber. Let her have parchment and quills. We'll see if she can be of use." She rubbed her freed wrists, inclining her head. "Thank you. I won't pretend I like captivity, but I'll abide by our terms." As they led her away, the Great John muttered, "You're too lenient, Robb. She's a viper." Mead shrugged. "Maybe, but I've seen more than enough Ironborn steel. If we avoid more bloodshed, it's worth a try." Robb pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaustion brimming. "We'll see. For now, we have a Greyjoy under our roof. Let's hope we don't regret it." Catelyn touched his arm in understanding. He was juggling Bolton's threat, the Lannisters' uncertain moves, the search for his siblings, and now a captive iron-born noble. This was the cost of wearing a crown, especially when half the realm was at war. She only prayed Asha's presence might avert further destruction, not create new strife. Snow continued to fall, day after day. The drifts around Winterfell rose waist-high in places, forcing men to shovel pathways from hall to hall. Repairs slowed to a crawl, though enough had been done to keep the castle from collapsing further. The farmland lay buried, but the hot springs around the gods would kept that corner relatively warm. People gathered in the Great Hall most evenings for warmth and shared meals. Asha Greyjoy was given a small tower chamber, heavily guarded. She wrote letters to various Ironborn captains rumored to linger in the north. A few ravens flew out, though whether they'd find their recipients in the midst of winter storms was uncertain. Every few days, Robb or one of his council questioned her, ensuring she was honest. She repeated her story. She wanted no part in Euron Crow's Eye's madness. She truly believed her father's war was lost, and she was willing to prove her sincerity if given the chance. Catelyn found herself strangely sympathetic at times. Asha seemed isolated, a fierce woman cast adrift by the same wars that had devoured the Stark children. Still, the memory of Theon's betrayal haunted them all. One day, while passing the corridor to Asha's chamber, Catelyn overheard a guard cursing, "We should kill all the Ironborn. They've done enough harm." She felt a pang of sadness. This was the world they lived in now. Layers of bitterness, alliances made from necessity rather than trust. Between snowstorms, ravens arrived from Riverrun with Brynden Tully's updates. Tywin Lannister was rumored to be forging an alliance with Prince Doran Martell of Dorne, or so rumor suggested. King's Landing was in turmoil over Tyrion's upcoming trial for Joffrey's murder. No mention of Sansa, though whisperers claimed she had vanished from the city. Another rumor said a large portion of the Crown's forces might redeploy north come spring, once the new King Tommen was settled. But the winter was nowhere near over. Roads would remain treacherous. From the Dreadfort region, still no direct sign of Roose Bolton. A few travelers mentioned Bolton men on the roads, extorting tolls or murdering stragglers, but no large host. Suspicion grew that Bolton was indeed trying to contact Tywin for help, or he might be assembling a force in secret. Dread lingered, but the only thing to do was keep watch. Amid these complexities, a sense of temporary pause took hold at Winterfell. The battered fortress hunkered under a blanket of white, the swirling snows lulling the war into a momentary lull. Soldiers spent more time around fires, sharing stories. Repairs focused on essential tasks, like patching rooftops over the bedchambers and storehouses. Hunts went out for game, returning with deer or the occasional boar. The nights were long, full of howling winds. During one such night, Catelyn joined Robb in the Great Hall where the men were singing a half-mournful ballad of the North. Candlelight danced over their tired faces. Robb had set aside his crown on the table as if it weighed too heavily. She sat beside him, nibbling a crust of bread. Occasionally, they exchanged a few murmured words about the day's progress, about rations. Yet the real conversation lay in shared glances that spoke of worry, longing, and a fierce will to endure. When the singing ended, silence fell. One of the older knights asked if the king in the north would speak. Robb rose with a nod, scanning the assembled men. "Friends," he said, his voice carrying quietly in the hush, "we stand in the grip of winter in a castle half-ruined. Our foes remain numerous, Bolton, the Ironborn, the Lannisters. Yet I've never felt prouder to stand among you. We have reclaimed our home. The wolves of Winterfell survived attempts to slaughter us at a wedding feast. We broke Tywin's host at Riverrun. We retook Mo Caelan. And day by day, stone by stone, we restore Winterfell. For that, I thank each and every one of you." A warm rumble of approval stirred. Men tapped their mugs against the tables. Robb spread his hands. "I will not lie, the road ahead is hard. But the North remembers. Our line endures. As long as we stand together, the traitors and usurpers will never truly conquer us." Another cheer rose, mingled with the hush of swirling snow beyond the windows. Catelyn felt tears prick her eyes, thinking of Ned, of how he might have addressed these men, quietly proud yet firm. Robb had become a figure of legend in his own right, a young king who turned the tide at the Red Wedding, a wolf who refused to die. If the realm had any justice, that legacy would see them through. Later that night, after the hall emptied, she lingered by the dying embers in the brazier. Outside, the wind howled. She recalled the last conversation she'd had with Ned in Winterfell's yard, before he left for King's Landing. He had spoken of duty, of the burdens of guardianship. Now their eldest son carried that weight. She whispered a prayer for him, for the living and the missing alike, hoping the old gods listened. The storms finally relented a few days hence, unveiling a crisp morning sky. The yard gleamed with fresh snow, the air sharp and clean. Robb ordered hunting parties out to replenish dwindling stores. The Great John led one group, stomping off with a half grin, promising a bounty of venison. Catelyn stayed behind, nursing a mild cough that had lingered since the last chill. She busied herself with the library salvage team, sorting more waterlogged tomes. By mid-morning, she took a break to walk the corridors, letting the bright winter sun stream through the broken windows. She paused in a corridor near the tower that housed Asha Greyjoy. A guard stepped aside to let her pass, but she hesitated. Perhaps she should speak with the Ironborn woman. Curiosity tugged at her. Asha was one of the few living links to Theon, to the last days of Winterfell's capture. Maybe Catelyn could glean details about her younger sons. She realized it might be fruitless, but she stepped forward anyway, motioning for the guard to open the door. The guard obeyed, entering first. Inside, the small chamber had a single shuttered window, a bed, and a table with quills, parchment, and sealing wax. A brazier glowed faintly. Asha sat in a chair, reading a battered copy of some old saga, perhaps borrowed from the library salvage. She looked up, blinking in surprise. "Lady Stark." Catelyn stepped in, the guard lingering by the doorway. "Good day, lady? Or do you prefer Captain Greyjoy?" Asha set aside the book. "I doubt I hold any rank worth naming these days." "Asha is fine." Catelyn nodded, glancing at the pages of letters scattered on the table. "You've been writing more ravens?" Asha shrugged. "Some. Can't say if they'll reach the recipients or if those captains remain in the north. But if they read my words, perhaps a few more will flee. That helps you, doesn't it?" Catelyn studied her. "I hope so. Fewer Ironborn means fewer dead." She paused. "I came for another reason. Your brother, Theon, did he ever speak of what truly happened to Bran and Rickon? Did he kill them?" She hated voicing the question, yet it tormented her. Asha's gaze dropped. "I don't know, my lady. He wrote me a letter once boasting he had them, but I never believed it fully. I suspect he faked their deaths with 2 peasant boys to scare the realm. I can't prove it. Maybe he lied, maybe not." She sighed. "I was furious with him for taking Winterfell. Told him father would not reward him. I never condone harming your sons if that's worth anything." Catelyn closed her eyes, relief and anguish mingling. So Theon's claims could have been a ruse. That had always been suspected, but no confirmation. Then they might still be alive? Asha exhaled. "I believe so. But they're lost. Theon fell soon after. My father's men turned on him. The bastard of Bolton took him, or so we heard. I can't imagine Theon kept hold of the boys if they lived. Possibly they slipped away into the wilds." A wave of conflicting emotions swept over Catelyn, hope that Bran and Rickon yet lived, horror at the idea of them wandering the north alone or captured by Bolton. "Thank you," she managed. Silence stretched, awkward. Asha clasped her hands in her lap. "Lady Stark, Theon and I were never close. But if by some twisted luck he's alive, maybe you'll find him. Or maybe not. He betrayed you as surely as he betrayed me. We all paid the price." Catelyn nodded, lips pressed tight. "We did." She studied Asha a moment longer. The woman's expression looked haunted, as though this war had robbed her of illusions. "For what it's worth," Catelyn said quietly, "I hope your father's death can end the Ironborn presence here. The North has bled too much." Asha gave a dry laugh. "Amen to that. I have no illusions about returning to the Isles a hero. Euron will rally the worst of them, but some might heed me. Enough to spare further bloodshed. That's all I can offer." Catelyn murmured a subdued farewell, stepping out of the chamber. The guard locked the door behind her. She walked away with a head spinning from the conversation. The possibility that Bran and Rickon might be alive was the single bright star in the gloom. Yet the path to finding them remained as murky as ever. She went in search of Robb, but he had already ridden out to inspect new repairs beyond the outer gate. She found him there, dismounted, talking with stonemasons about reinforcing the collapsed corner. Snow glistened on his cloak, gray wind pacing at his side. He turned, saw her face and frowned. "Mother, you look pale. Are you well?" She told him of her exchange with Asha. Rob's eyes flickered with renewed hope. So Theon likely lied about killing them. We always suspected, but hearing it from Asha… He paused, swallowing. "We must keep searching, if we can gather any clue." A gloom returned to his expression as he realized the limited ways to do so in the midst of winter and war. Still, a spark of determination lit his voice. "They might be out there. Maybe they sought refuge with the Umbers or the Reeds. We'll keep trying." Catelyn nodded, tears pricking her eyes. "One day we'll know. The gods can't be so cruel as to deprive us of all our children. Arya, Bran, Rickon, Sansa. May the gods watch over them." Robb embraced her gently. The stonemasons averted their gazes, respectful of the moment. Snow drifted around them, hush and sorrow intermixed with a slender thread of hope. Winterfell might stand battered, but House Stark's spirit had not succumbed. In the following weeks, the seasons slid deeper into winter's grasp. Hunting became more perilous, the harvest from the glass gardens meager. The nights stretched long and dark. Ravens from White Harbor brought small but welcome shipments of salted fish and barley, courtesy of Lord Manderley. Men rationed carefully. The atmosphere at Winterfell was stoic, as if everyone had settled into a siege not from enemies, but from the season itself. Then, on a bleak morning thick with low gray clouds, an outrider rushed into the yard bearing urgent tidings. Panting, half-frozen, he demanded audience with the king in the north. Robb and Catelyn assembled in the Great Hall with the Great John. Midge Mormont returned from her coastal campaign and other notables. The outrider, trembling, reported Bolton men on the King's Road, perhaps 300, riding north in close formation. They waved banners, some flayed man, some Lannister lion. They're still days away, but they're coming here. A murmur of shock and anger spread. The Great John slammed a fist on the table. Bolton's in bed with the Lannisters, the bloody traitor. Robb's face hardened. So be it. He wants to test our walls. We'll see how well he fares. 300 men is not an army to bring down Winterfell, but it might be a vanguard. Possibly more behind them. Midge frowned. Roose knows our gates are still damaged. If Tywin gave him crossbowmen or siege gear, it could be trouble. Catelyn recalled Bolton's envoy. He had demanded terms which Robb refused. Now it seemed Bolton had found an ally. Could Tywin spare men after the fiasco at Riverrun? Robb raked a hand through his hair. Apparently. Or maybe these are leftover mercenaries or bannermen. We can't guess. We must prepare the castle. The men are strong, we have archers. Let them come. We'll not yield. A hush fell. Everyone understood that a battle or siege loomed in the heart of winter, battered walls or not. Robb turned to the outrider. You've done well. Warm yourself. Spread the word that all men able to fight should arm. We hold the walls at any cost. That day, Winterfell buzzed with urgent activity. Men manned the ramparts, piling up stones and spare timbers to fortify the breaches. The blacksmith worked frantically, sharpening arrowheads and reinforcing swords. The Great John oversaw the distribution of old spears and axes to any villager willing to stand in defense. Midge Mormont readied her Bear Island women, each as fierce as any man. Scouts rode out to watch the roads for signs of additional enemy columns. By dusk, a hush of dread settled over the fortress. Snow continued to fall, layering the half-repaired walls in a white veneer. Fires lit the courtyard. Sentries in thick furs patrolled the ramparts, crossbows in hand. The wind carried the scent of oncoming conflict. Robb stood near the gatehouse with gray wind, surveying the gloom. Catelyn joined him, pulling her cloak tight. Waging war in deep winter, she said quietly, Bolton must be desperate or mad. Maybe both, Robb replied. Or he thinks we're weak from the sacking. If Tywin gave him gold or men, he might believe he can take me by surprise. She turned to him, a stab of worry. If they lay siege, can we hold out? Our supplies, he nodded grimly. We have enough for a few months at least, plus the hot springs. Bolton can't match a fully fortified Winterfell without major siege engines. If it's only a few hundred men, we stand a good chance. She swallowed. Another test, then after all they'd endured. We'll stand with you. He put an arm around her shoulders briefly. Then, summoning resolve, he barked orders to the men to remain vigilant. Through the night, the fortress was on alert. Torches flared on the ramparts, watchers posted in every tower. Snow fell in thick drifts, occasionally swirling into the great hall where people dozed uneasily near dying fires. Morning arrived in a pale hush, the yard ankle-deep in new-fallen snow. The watchers from the ramparts reported no sign of Bolton's host yet. That might mean the weather slowed them. Men remained tense, expecting the enemy's approach at any moment. A day passed, then another, the tension winding tighter. Finally, near dusk on the third day, horns blew from the outer walls. Figures emerged on the King's Road, outlines in the drifting snow, riders in a line, carrying banners. Robb donned his fur cloak, took up his sword, and ascended the ramparts with Catelyn, the Great John, and a cadre of guards. Grey wind bounded alongside, bearing fangs at the whiff of unknown men. Through the swirling white, they saw them, a column of riders, perhaps 200 or 300, bearing the flayed man standard. Interspersed among them were a few red and gold Lannister flags. At their head was a tall man in pale armor, half his face hidden by a scarf. He halted within shouting distance of the walls. An uneasy hush fell. Robb raised his voice to carry over the wind. "Roose Bolton, show yourself if you dare." The tall man removed his scarf, revealing a pale face with thin lips. "Roose Bolton." He blinked in the snow, voice carrying eerily. "Greetings, King in the North. I trust you recall my offer of parley." A growl rose from the onlookers on the wall. Robb stared down coldly. "You come with Lannister banners. I see no reason to speak of peace." Roose smiled, a thin curve of the lips almost polite. "I had hoped you'd see reason. Let me in, we speak as befits two lords. This silly war can end." The Great John snarled. "You'll get a sword through your guts, traitor." Bolton's voice carried a mocking edge. "Such hostility. I have enough men behind me to make this a difficult day for you. And Tywin Lannister has promised me reinforcements if I hold Winterfell until spring." Robb glared. "You won't enter these walls. If you want parley, come alone, unarmed." Bolton chuckled softly. "And have you loosed that monster wolf on me?" "No, thank you. I propose a different arrangement. Open the gates. Let me station my men inside as well. We share the castle's warmth, gather at a table, and talk this through." A roar of fury burst from the Starks above. One soldier spat over the rampart. "We'll die before we let you inside." Roose Bolton shrugged mildly, turning to survey his men. "Very well. It seems we must resort to sterner measures. I have crossbowmen behind that rise and more men on the road. If you resist, we'll starve you out or storm the breaches that remain undone." His pale eyes flicked upward. "Is that truly what you want, Robb Stark? Your father's castle sacked again?" Robb's lips peeled back in a snarl. "We overcame Walder Frey's treachery and Tywin's host. We'll not kneel to a coward like you." Bolton's face gave nothing away. "Your choice. I'll camp here with my men. Blockade the castle. If you wish to come to your senses, send word. Otherwise, prepare for a long, cold siege." He wheeled his horse, his men forming ranks. A drizzle of freezing sleet began to fall, pattering on armor and banners. The watchers on the walls seethed with anger, crossbows loaded. But Bolton's forces kept out of easy range. Catelyn felt dread coil in her stomach. A siege in the dead of winter with partial walls, a limited store of food, and the knowledge that Tywin might still send more men. Robb gazed at the snowy field, voice stiff with hatred. "So it begins. We hold. The North remembers, and I'll see Bolton pay for every life he's taken." Catelyn nodded, though fear gnawed at her. Another trial, another test of House Stark's resilience. She gripped the rampart, letting the cold seep into her hands. Bolton had chosen his side, brandishing Lannister banners, while the Starks huddled in a wounded fortress. Yet a fierce resolve stirred in her chest. They had faced betrayal at the Twins and lived. They had faced Tywin at Riverrun and triumphed. Now they would face the Leech Lord on their own ground. The watchers around her braced themselves, eyes hard, jaws set. Through the swirling sleet, Roose Bolton's men began pitching tents in the distance. A ring of steel encircling Winterfell again. Catelyn glanced to Robb, who stood unyielding, gray wind at his side, as if daring the traitor to strike. War had taught them that victory could be won against all odds. The North remembered indeed. If the Red Wedding had not killed the wolves, no blockade or cunning scheme would do so easily. Night closed in, bringing gloom and howling wind. Torches flickered, men hammered extra braces on the gate. Catelyn withdrew to find warmth near the Great Hall's central fire. Outside, the siege lines formed. House Stark, battered but unbeaten, prepared for a final reckoning with the last traitor who threatened their homeland. And in that tense hush, one truth burned clear. Whatever cunning ruse Bolton thought he possessed, he faced a family honed by betrayal, shaped by heartbreak, and powered by the unbreakable spirit of the North. The flayed man had come to the wolf's den. Now the test of winter and would decide whose banner would fly when the snows melted and whether the Red Wedding's survivors would carve yet another triumph from the jaws of treachery, proving once and for all that a wolf cornered in its own lair was the most dangerous beast in all the Seven Kingdoms. Night settled heavily upon Winterfell, bringing with it a keening wind that swept over the half-repaired walls and rattled half-ruined shutters. By the dim glow of torches in the courtyard, one could just make out the dark silhouettes of Roose Bolton's siege lines, drawn up beyond arrow range. White drifts of snow reflected the distant lantern light so that the figures were at once ghost-like and ominous. Men huddled on Winterfell's battlements, crossbows in hand, peering uneasily at that silent encampment. Even with so few souls within those tents, some 300 men at most, and possibly more lurking out of sight, it carried the weight of a threat the Starks could not afford to dismiss. For weeks, King Robb Stark and his allies had labored to restore Winterfell's battered defenses, preparing for just such an onslaught. And now the day had come. Roose Bolton, once a bannerman of House Stark, had returned under the banners of the Flayed Man and the Golden Lion, presumably with Lannister gold or hidden reinforcements at his disposal. The betrayal that Robb and Catelyn Stark had feared was made manifest in the swirl of snow beyond their gate. Inside the Great Hall, the air was thick with tension. A few fires crackled in braziers, throwing flickers of orange across the scarred walls. Tables had been shoved aside, replaced by weapon racks, crates of arrows, piles of fresh-fletched bolts. Groups of men, Umbers, Mormonts, Manderleys, and various northern knights, clustered near the warmth, bracing themselves for word that the siege had turned violent. Some sharpened swords or axes, others quietly mended armor straps. The cold was bone-deep, but their readiness for war provided a kind of fierce heat. Robb stood at the head of the hall, gray wind at his side, scanning the faces of his council. The Great John, towering and broad, was present, as were Meage Mormont and her daughters. Ser Wendell Manderley represented White Harbor's contingent. And nearer the dais stood Catelyn Stark herself, fatigued but resolute, her cloak lined with gray fur, offering her son a quiet, steady support. A hush fell as Robb addressed them. The Flayed Man's banners are raised outside our walls. Whether Roose Bolton has more men hidden in the woods or on the roads, we cannot say, but we must assume he does. Our watchers tell us they're erecting tents, building fires, and setting up lines to watch our gates. They may attempt to starve us out, or they may try a direct assault if they find a weak point. The Great John smacked a meaty fist against his palm. Let them come. If Tywin Lannister has promised him aid, we might see more than these 300 before long, maybe a relief force riding up the King's Road once the snows let up. Catelyn rubbed her arms to ward off a chill. The wind from outside seeped into every crack of Winterfell's damaged walls, turning the hall into a drafty warren. We're strong behind these walls, she said, but we're also not fully repaired. Certain sections remain weakened. The hot springs keep the ground warm enough that some areas haven't frozen, but a determined foe could exploit the breaches if they get close. Ser Wendell Manderley, a thick-set man with an earnest, honest face, bobbed his head. Better we hold them at arrow range. Let the cold do its work on them. If we can keep them pinned outside, they'll find foraging for food difficult in deep winter. Meanwhile, we have enough stores to last a few months. Provided the siege doesn't extend beyond that, Robb observed, voice tightly controlled. If Bolton invests the castle for the entirety of winter, we'll be pressed. We must hope for an opportunity to break his lines or to lure him into open battle on our terms. The Great John let out a rumble of agreement, nodding vigorously. Make him come to us, I say. His men are no mountain goats, nor are they used to long sieges in such harsh cold. If we hold strong, they'll either freeze or lose heart. Meage Mormont scanned the faces. What if he tries to parley again, offering terms? After all, he demanded the same in his envoy's last attempt, wanting to share the castle. Nonsense, but still. Robb's jaw set. I refused him once and I'll refuse again. He has no right to call himself a Lord of the North after conspiring to kill us at the Twins and siding with Tywin. I'll not let him inside these walls. A general murmur of approval swept through the group. The great John lifted his tankard in a mocking toast to the absent Bolton. Damn him to the seven hells. We'll see how he fares in a real siege. Robb turned to more practical matters, rotating the watch, distributing arms among the men, planning hunts for fresh game in the Wolf's Wood if conditions allowed. Each arrangement was recorded by a steward scrawling notes on half-ruined parchment. In the uncertain hours ahead, organization would be the difference between survival and collapse. At length, the council dispersed. Men drifted off to their duties or to the meager comfort of a shared meal. Catelyn lingered with Robb at the brazier where the fire's embers glowed faintly. Grey Wind rested his chin on Robb's thigh, occasionally lifting his head as though sniffing for danger. "What do you think, Mother?" Robb asked softly. "Can we hold?" She could see the weight of war etched into his young face, the faint lines of worry that had deepened since their triumphant stand at River Run. "We've endured worse. The Red Wedding was supposed to kill us all, yet here we stand. We have time, resources, and the advantage of walls. Bolton's men, even with some Lannister gold, will find no easy victory here." He nodded, seemingly reassured. "I want to be sure we're prepared for a long standoff. If Tywin rides north with reinforcements, then we'll face him as we did before," Catelyn said, more calmly than she felt. "We have loyal houses around the north. White Harbor cannot send a large army in the snow, but they might harry any southern approach. The Umbers still stand with us, so do the Glovers and the Reeds in the neck." A sad flicker of amusement touched Robb's lips. If Howland Reed's Crannogmen choose to harass Bolton's supply lines, that might hamper him as well. But we can't rely too much on uncertain raids. They fell silent, comforted only by the minimal warmth of the coals. Eventually, Robb sighed. "Rest while you can, Mother. Tomorrow might bring chaos if Bolton tests our defenses. I'll see to the Watchers." Catelyn squeezed his arm gently. "Don't stay up too long." He nodded, giving a faint, weary smile, and made for the courtyard. Grey Wind padded after him, ears pricked. Catelyn watched them go, her heart aching with maternal worry. If only Ned were here, she thought he would guide Robb with unerring calm. But Ned was gone, and the North must rely on Ned's son, who had already proven himself more than once. Catelyn returned to her chamber, one of the few with a mostly intact roof and walls, though drafts still crept in. She drew her cloak tight, lay on the straw pallet, and tried to sleep. Memories of all they'd endured swam behind her eyelids, the near slaughter at the twins' turn to stark victory, Tywin's defeat at River Run, the uncertain fate of her missing children. She prayed the gods would keep her family safe yet again. Morning arrived in a hush of pale light. Sentries reported that Bolton's men had built a ring of snow-fortified earthworks at a distance, presumably to keep watch on the castle. There was little sign of immediate aggression, no massed lines or siege towers. And so the siege began in earnest, with an uneasy stalemate settled between the traitors outside the walls and the loyalists within. Days slipped by under a dull sky. Winter's stranglehold tightened. The sun, when it emerged, offered little warmth, merely glinting off the snow. Winterfell's men braved the ramparts in thick furs, stamping their feet to keep blood circulating. Crossbow squads were assigned vantage points overlooking the causeway leading to the shattered gates. At intervals, they saw movement beyond arrow range, Bolton's scouts or huntsmen gleaning what small game they could. The Watchers traded insults across the snowy field, but no real battle was joined. Within the walls, Robb and his captains established a strict routine. Work details repaired internal damage. The blacksmith's forge was kept hot, though with limited fuel. The Great Hall served as a central mustering space, and the partially mended towers housed the horses and crucial supplies. For the moment, they were well provisioned, though no one relished the idea of a siege that lasted until spring. Some nights, horns sounded from the Bolton camp, echoing across the frosty air as if testing the defenders' nerves. Each time, men sprang awake, seizing arms and rushing to the ramparts. Yet Bolton never advanced. It was the old game of wearing an enemy down, letting fear and exhaustion do the work. 2 weeks into this pattern, rumors stirred that Bolton's men had begun clearing a path in the woods east of Winterfell, perhaps planning to surround the castle fully. Scouts venturing out on foot in the gloom reported seeing small tents, supply wagons, lines of footprints. And yet, the deeper the snows, the harder it was for an army to maneuver. One evening, as the sun slid behind heavy clouds, Catelyn joined Robb on the ramparts overlooking the main gate. The sky was streaked with purple and gray, and the fields below lay shrouded in half-light. She could see the faint glow of fires in Bolton's camp, the silhouettes of men moving beyond the outer earthworks. A grim hush pervaded the battlements. Robb's breath steamed as he spoke. We've had no word from them since that first day, but they persist. My men say it's a siege in all but name. If we attempt to sally forth, we'll meet crossbow volleys. If we stay behind the walls, we risk starvation if they block any hunting or supply run." Grey Wind paced behind them, ears stiff. Caitlin wrapped her cloak tighter. "Can we expect any relief from White Harbor?" "Not soon," Robb said wearily. "The roads are all but impassable. Lord Manderley's last raven said he'd do what he could, but the storms hamper any large force. There's also Tywin to consider. He might dispatch men to support Bolton once the roads are clearer. We stand alone for the moment." She rested a hand on his shoulder. "Then we make the best of it. You turned the trap at the twins into Walder Frey's downfall. You can outlast Roose Bolton here. He's gambling that Tywin will rescue him if he commits." Robb gave a resolute nod, scanning the horizon. "We'll hold. Let him huddle out there in the cold. We know these walls, and winter is our element, not his." The next day, however, brought a twist. The watchers at dawn noticed a handful of men in Bolton's colors approaching under a white flag, not close enough to be easily shot, but within hail. They cried out for a parley. Sighing with disgust, Robb ordered archers to stand ready in case of treachery, then ascended to the rampart with Caitlin, the Great John, and a few knights. Below, a rider raised his voice. "His lordship, Lord Bolton, desires another audience with the king in the north. He promises safe conduct for a parley in neutral ground halfway between our lines." A bark of laughter emerged from the Great John. "Your flayed man can crawl back to his dank hole. We want none of his talk." Robb set a hand on the stone parapet, leaning out just enough to be heard. "We offered Bolton one chance to come alone, unarmed, into Winterfell to face justice. He refused. Now he wants me to meet him in the open so his crossbowmen can pick me off." The Bolton herald spread his arms in an exaggerated shrug. "He would bring only a small guard, no crossbows, to prove his sincerity. You would bring the same. There is no need for bloodshed on a day meant for negotiation." Robb's stare was cold. "There will be no negotiation. Tell your lord, come alone to face justice, or remain outside these walls until the day we sally forth to kill him." The herald hesitated, no doubt anticipating the scorn. "You speak in absolutes, your grace, but perhaps you might reconsider. Lord Bolton, in concert with the Lannisters, can promise you safe passage south, recognition of your title, or a share in." A sharp whistle from above, and an arrow thudded into the ground near the herald's horse, courtesy of an Umber scout. The horse spooked, nearly throwing the man. The herald yelped, pulling the reins tight. "That's our answer," the Great John roared. "Begone." With a final, hateful glare, the herald wheeled about and galloped back to Bolton's lines. The watchers on the battlements cheered. Robb pursed his lips. Let's hope he doesn't attempt a direct assault after that. Stay vigilant. From then on, the tension only rose. Late that night, horns blared again from Bolton's camp. This time, a volley of flaming arrows shot into the sky, bright orange streaks that arced and fell short of Winterfell's walls. A mocking display, but no real attack, just another attempt to keep the defenders awake and on edge. So it continued, a slow, grinding standoff in the dead of winter. As the weeks passed, the Great Hall turned into a communal shelter each night, with dozens of soldiers sleeping in close quarters for warmth. The provisions lasted so far, though the hunts brought back ever scantier kills, a scrawny buck, a handful of rabbits, once a half-starved boar. Rationing became more severe. Men began to crave fresh greens, fresh fruit. The best they could do was supplement bread and salt fish with onions from old cellars. Asha Greyjoy remained a captive in her tower room under guard. She occasionally wrote more letters or sent the ravens she had at her disposal, though with Bolton's men around, it was questionable if any Ironborn could get near. She seemed frustrated yet oddly resigned to her captivity, sometimes exchanging tense words with her jailers. Caitlin caught Robb or Midge Mormont occasionally seeking her counsel about any rumored alliance between Bolton and the Ironborn, but Asha only shrugged. "If Euron's men are in the area, I don't know of it," she would say, her tone guarded. Among the ranks, however, frustration simmered. The Great John was used to decisive battles, not this waiting game. Ser Wendell Manderley looked more worried by the day, especially after hearing no fresh word from White Harbor. Midge Mormont prowled the corridors, lamenting that they couldn't slip out and hunt Bolton's men in the night. "But we'd be outnumbered in open ground," she'd admit grudgingly. "And the snows would betray our movements." Caitlin became aware of a deeper problem as the siege stretched on, morale risked faltering. Men who had braved Harrenhal and Riverrun were unaccustomed to sitting behind crumbled walls, trapped in a half-ruined keep. The boisterous attitude that had carried them through the first weeks now gave way to silent endurance. Yet in that silent endurance, a quiet resoluteness also thrived. There were no illusions here. House Stark must hold Winterfell or see the North's heart lost again. One frosty dawn, watchmen spotted movement near the southwestern side of the castle, a small group of Bolton men on horseback picking their way through the snowy rubble outside the collapsed sections. They seemed to be scouting potential weak points, possibly testing if they could set ladders. Arrows flew from the ramparts and the men hastily retreated. But it was enough to put the defenders on alert that an assault could come any time. That evening, Robb assembled his closest captains in the old solar where Ned Stark used to work. A brazier glowed, but the cold seeped through cracks in the walls. The Great John, Meege, Wendell Manderly, and a handful of knights ringed the table. Even Asha Greyjoy was there under heavy guard, though only because Robb had chosen to question her about any hidden approaches. Her hands were shackled, but she stood tall, her gaze darting to the map pinned to a plank. Robb tapped the map. The southwestern breach is the largest opening from the prior sacking. We've shored it up with timbers and rubble, but a determined force might attempt to break through. We'll station archers here, he pointed, and a small reserve behind them. The Great John thumped his fist. I'll lead the reserve, your grace. Let them try. We'll slaughter them in the breach. Meege nodded. I'll keep some Mormont spears on the ramparts above. Asha Greyjoy cleared her throat, earning glares from the men. If Bolton tries a direct assault, he'll likely do it at night, under cover of storm or darkness. He wants to catch you unawares. Robb gave her a measured look. We'll be vigilant at all hours. If you're to help us, can you offer any insight on infiltration? Asha tilted her head, a half-shrug tugging at her shoulders. Ironborn might attempt a stealth approach through a postern gate, but Bolton's not Ironborn. He's a land-based fighter. Still, look for cunning. He might dig tunnels or set up a hidden approach. He's not above trickery. The Great John snorted. We won't let him. If they start digging, we'll hear it in the night. They continued hashing out details, watch rotations, signals for reinforcements, fallback positions if one wall was breached. The constant swirl of possibilities cast a pall over the room, each man knowing how precarious a siege in winter truly was. At the end, Robb turned to the question of sallying out. Part of me wonders if we should strike first. A swift night raid on Bolton's camp, sow confusion, perhaps force him to retreat. Meege frowned. We can do it with a small force, but if it fails, we lose valuable men in open snow. They have crossbows, we have little cover. Are we ready for that gamble? Catelyn placed a hand on her son's arm. We must weigh the cost, Robb. If the raid fails, Bolton might realize how desperately we cling to advantage. Robb's face grew grim. We'll wait. For now, we have the advantage of walls. Unless a starved madness overtakes us, we can outlast them, at least for some time. They disbanded, each returning to their tasks or to bed. The unspoken fear that Bolton might lash out tonight, tomorrow, or any day hung over Winterfell like a sword on a thin thread. Sure enough, a mere day later, near midnight, horns blared from the southwestern wall. Sentinels cried out, they're coming. Lanterns flared in the courtyard. Men scrambled for weapons, boot steps slapping the cold stones. Robb dashed from his chamber, sword half-belted, gray wind snarling at his side. Catelyn, awakened by the commotion, threw on a cloak and followed. Outside, the sky was an inky void. Snow blew in gusts. Flames from torches illuminated swirling flakes. On the ramparts above the southwestern breach, archers loosed arrows into the darkness. Shapes moved below, at the edge of flickering light, dozens of men in Bolton's livery, some with battered shields, some hoisting ladders. The clash of steel echoed as defenders met them atop the rubble barricade. Form up, the Great John roared, bounding to the breach with a group of umbers. Meege Mormont and her spears were already there, jabbing down at the attackers who scrabbled over logs and stone. Men shouted in pain as arrow after arrow found flesh. The wind whipped the screams away. On a second rampart, more archers targeted the incoming wave. The Bolton men pressed forward, though reckless with the knowledge that if they broke in, they might seize the castle's courtyard. A half-dozen made it to the top of the rubble, only to be met by Meege's spear thrusts and the Great John's massive axe. Blood sprayed across the frosty timbers. Bodies tumbled down. Robb rushed to the forward line, ignoring Catelyn's shout to keep back. He joined the defenders, sword slicing into a Bolton man who tried to climb the barricade. Greywind lunged, dragging another soldier down, savage joys clamped on an arm. A clang of steel on steel rung out as an enemy swung at Robb, but the king in the north parried, then drove his blade under the man's ribs. The attacker collapsed with a dying groan. Catelyn hovered behind the line, heart hammering, powerless but to watch. Others brought torches so the defenders could see. Arrows rained from both sides, some thunking into logs or corpses. The assault was intense but disorganized. Bolton had perhaps hoped the defenders would be sleeping or unprepared. Instead, he found them braced for war. In less than half an hour, the assault faltered. Men in flayed man livery staggered back, dragging the wounded, cursing the Starks' stubborn defense. Another volley of arrows from the ramparts forced them to retreat further. Soon, the shapes melted away into the darkness, leaving behind the moans of the dying. "Hold!" the great John roared, drenched in sweat and spattered blood. "Hold your ground!" Silence slowly returned, broken only by harsh breaths and whimpers. Robb ordered searchers to check for any hidden intruders. None were found. Catelyn ventured to the barricade with a lantern, stepping gingerly over fallen bodies. Northern men scoured pockets for anything of value or intelligence. They found little. In the torchlight, Robb's face was ashen. His sword dripped red onto the snow. When he spotted his mother, relief warred with anger on his features. "You shouldn't be so close," he admonished in a hoarse voice. She merely bowed her head, pressing a hand to his cheek. "I had to see you safe." He took a slow breath. "We've driven them off for now. Count our dead and tend our wounded. If that was Bolton's test, we've answered." Murmurs of agreement rose. Some men spat on the bodies of the invaders. Others clenched fists in silent triumph. The great John allowed himself a ragged grin, though he'd taken a shallow cut across one arm. "Not so cunning now, are they, eh?" he said. "They left a half-dozen of their own to bleed out." Midge Mormont crouched by a dead attacker, yanking off his helm. "Ragged lot. Probably not Bolton's best. Testing to see if we were off our guard. We showed them otherwise." Still, the victory was far from comforting. This had been a mere probing assault. Bolton had hundreds of men at his command. He might attempt a grander push or an extended siege strategy. At Robb's command, the bodies, both friend and foe, were collected. The enemy corpses were dragged outside the walls and left for Bolton's men to retrieve or ignore. The Stark dead would be given proper rites at first light. Injured soldiers were carried to a makeshift infirmary in the Great Hall, where the maester and a few volunteers did what they could. Catelyn spent the rest of the night assisting, cleaning wounds, offering water, holding men's hands as they moaned in pain. It was nearing dawn when she finally sat alone, hands trembling from exhaustion. Outside, a faint gray light crept across the courtyard. The horns had ceased. The watchers on the walls reported no fresh attacks. In an odd hush, the day began. Robb found her on a bench, half collapsed with fatigue. Wordlessly, he sat beside her, leaning his sword against the table. Gray wind rested at his feet, equally tired. She managed a weary smile. "You fought bravely." He closed his eyes, drawing in a slow breath. "We all did. We lost men, though." He didn't speak the number. Catelyn didn't ask. She knew that every life weighed on him. "We'll mourn them," she said gently. "They died defending their home." He nodded, silence falling once more. The echoes of battle lingered in both their minds. Shrieks in the dark, the tang of blood on snow, the knowledge that this was but a fraction of the storm that might yet break. That morning, a cluster of survivors from Bolton's attack did indeed limp away from the outskirts, carrying or dragging wounded comrades. A thick snowfall soon covered their tracks. By midday, another hail of taunts rose from the Bolton lines, claiming the defenders would not last, cursing the Starks. The Great John roared back defiance from the walls, hurling insults about flayed men and cowardice. But no second assault came that day, and so the siege ground on. The men of Winterfell reinforced the southwestern barricade further, stacking more rubble and timbers, planting sharpened stakes. The rest of the perimeter was likewise watched. Scouts in the towers kept a constant eye for the first sign of movement. The battered castle seemed to sink deeper into the snows as though drawing in upon itself for warmth. The great hall became a hospital by night, lined with the wounded on pallets, while healthy soldiers crowded around braziers in near silence. Catelyn joined the maester in distributing salves, stitching gashes, whispering small comforts to dying men. On one such night, she passed by a gravely wounded archer who beckoned her close, rasping something about how proud he was to serve the king in the north. She squeezed his hand, tears slipping down her cheeks as he coughed up blood. He died before dawn. Robb, too, found little sleep. He spent hours pacing the courtyard, scanning the ramparts, or conferring with the Great John and Midge Mormont about strategy. Some men believed another direct assault might come at any moment. Others suspected Bolton would rely on time and the threat of reinforcements from Tywin come spring. Amid this tension, a surprising visitor arrived under Winterfell's gates one snowy afternoon. Sentries spotted a single rider approaching from the north, not from Bolton's lines but from the direction of the King's Road bend leading to the Wolfswood. The man wore a black cloak trimmed with fur, no visible sigil. He raised empty hands, calling for audience with the king in the north. Archers readied on the walls as the gates parted just enough for the solitary rider to pass into the courtyard. Catelyn stood alongside Robb, gray sky overhead. Gray wind prowled, snarling low. The rider dismounted with stiff movements, pulling back his hood to reveal a narrow, wind-chapped face. He bowed. "Greetings, your grace. I come on behalf of Howland Reed, Lord of Greywater Watch." A flutter of relief crossed Robb's features, though he remained guarded. "Lord Reed's messenger?" "Yes, your grace." The man spoke quickly, clearly chilled to the bone. "He sends word that his crannogmen have observed signs of more Bolton men crossing the neck. A small party, perhaps. They appear to be heading south, maybe to meet someone. Lord Reed believes Bolton tries to coordinate with an outside force. Possibly Lannister reinforcements. He thought you should know." Catelyn's heart sank. "So Bolton has parted with some men? That could mean he's summoning more from the south, or forging a route for them to come up later." Robb exhaled. "Thank you. This is valuable intelligence. Is Lord Reed able to intercept them?" The messenger frowned. "We'll harass them if we can pick off stragglers. But the neck is vast, and Bolton's folk move carefully. The swamps hamper large-scale fighting. Lord Reed also says if you have men to spare, a raiding party in the neck might hamper Bolton's reinforcements. But we realize your forces are pinned here." Robb pressed his lips together, frustration clear. "We can't send a large party. Maybe a small group of skilled outriders. But I can't break the siege on a whim. We must remain strong at Winterfell." The man nodded, understanding. "Lord Reed said as much. He only wanted you informed." They gave the messenger food and a warm place to rest. By nightfall, he departed back into the swirling snow, determined to return to Greywater Watch. Robb mulled whether to dispatch even a dozen men to the neck. After conferring with Meege and the Greatjon, he decided they could not risk it. Every fighter was needed to defend Winterfell. Thus, the possibility loomed that Bolton, starved for more strength, might indeed find it if the Lannisters chose to respond. With the memory of Tywin's earlier defeats and the chaos in King's Landing after Joffrey's death, it was impossible to know how swiftly a southern relief might come. Some men argued that Tywin would not commit to a northern campaign in deep winter. Others feared Tywin's cunning overcame such obstacles. In the bitter evenings that followed, Catelyn sometimes found her way to the Godswood, a corner of Winterfell still lush with steam from the hot springs. The heart tree with its carved face stood sentient, amid the swirling snowmelt. She prayed there, recalling Ned's solemn presence, hoping the old gods might shield them yet again. Once or twice, she glimpsed Robb there as well, silent and still, as if listening for fatherly wisdom that could not return. Time blurred in the monotony of the siege. Each day dawned with scouring winds. The watchers reported on Bolton's camp, and men maintained the defenses. Each night ended in uneasy slumber or frantic vigil if horns sounded from the enemy lines. The defenders grew gaunt from half-rations. Meat was scarce, bread staled, onions sprouted. Yet no one spoke of surrender. The memory of Frey's betrayal burned too bright, the knowledge that they had triumphed once fueling a fierce pride. Weeks later, just past what might have been midwinter, the strangest rumor began circulating. Some of Bolton's men were deserting under cover of darkness. Observers from the walls had seen shapes leaving the camp at night, never to return. By day, Bolton's forces looked sparser. Fewer patrols, fewer tents. The watchers speculated that men were simply dying or fleeing. A siege in winter was brutal for the besiegers too. Without proper supply lines, Bolton could not feed them well. Then, at dawn of a particularly cold morning, horns shattered the quiet once again, but not from Winterfell. From Bolton's lines, guards rushed to the ramparts. Through the swirling snowfall, they saw disarray in the enemy camp. Men were shouting, gesturing in anger. A portion of Bolton's tents were half collapsed, footprints leading away in the snow. What in seven hells is happening? the Great John growled. Robb, at the parapet with Catelyn, squinted into the distance. They seemed to be fighting among themselves. Some men are leaving. Could it be they're out of food? Or a mutiny? Meej, leaning over a Merlin, let out a harsh laugh. This might be our chance. If there's infighting, we can sally forth and strike before they rally. Robb grimaced. Or it's a trap to lure us out into the open. But we can't ignore the possibility. He quickly gathered his captains in the Great Hall for a rushed council. The Great John argued fervently for a surprise attack. They're in disarray, Your Grace. Let me lead the cavalry out the gate. Circle around. Chop them to pieces while they're distracted. Meej agreed, though she cautioned. We must be swift and come back before any hidden force can counter. If they have crossbows waiting, we risk losses. Sir Wendell Manderley nodded. A short, sharp sally might pay off big. If they truly lack cohesion, we could rout them from Winterfell altogether. Catelyn's heart hammered. She recalled how bold strokes had won them triumph at Riverrun. But she also recalled how the Red Wedding's betrayal nearly cost them everything. Bolton was cunning. She pressed her lips together. What if it's an act? Bolton could be staging a fake mutiny to lure us out. We have partial gates and walls. Once we open them, we're vulnerable. Robb weighed the arguments, tension etched in every line of his face. Finally, he said, a small force. Not all of us. If it's a trap, we must keep enough men to hold Winterfell. Great John, you lead a sally with perhaps 50 horse and a few archers on foot. Hit them fast, gauge the situation. If it's truly chaos, we'll press. If you sense a trap, pull back. Understood. The Great John grinned fiercely, slapping a mailed fist to his chest. I won't fail you, my king. Within an hour, they were ready. The battered main gate was opened enough to let riders pass two abreast. The Great John led the column, snow swirling around them, swords and axes at the ready. A handful of foot archers followed, prepared to loose covering fire if needed. Robb and the main force stayed inside, archers on the ramparts covering the outward approach. Catelyn, observing from above, felt her breath catch as she saw the Great John vanish into the white haze. If this failed, if it was a cunning ruse by Bolton, these brave riders might not return. Below, the watchers spied confusion in Bolton's lines. Indeed, some men were in a heated argument, others packing up gear. A portion of the camp looked half-abandoned. As the Great John's riders approached, the watchers saw figures in flayed man tabards scattered in disorganized clusters. Then it happened. The Great John unleashed a thunderous war cry and the northern cavalry charged. What followed was a swirl of chaos. Archers atop Winterfell's walls watched as the cavalry slammed into the camp's perimeter, cutting down startled guards. The men who had been quarreling seemed uncertain whether to mount a defense. Some tried to rally, brandishing spears, but the Great John's ferocity carved through them. Others simply fled. Gods, it's real, Meej muttered from the rampart. They're truly in disarray. Arrows from the foot archers found easy targets among the scattered enemy. Within minutes, the Great John's riders had carved a path deep into Bolton's tents. Torchbearers set some canvas ablaze. The watchers saw men screaming as flames licked through the camp. Yet amid the confusion, one nucleus of resistance coalesced near a tall banner showing the flayed man. There, a handful of mounted knights or officers wearing partial Lannister gear tried to organize. At their center, a pale rider with a fur cloak, possibly Roose Bolton himself. Catelyn strained to see from afar. She made out a swirl of half-seen combat as the Great John hammered into them. Shouts rose, steel clanged. The watchers saw horses rear, men topple. The Great John's laugh was audible even at the walls. Bolton's cluster reeled from the onslaught, then spurred away, attempting to retreat further from Winterfell. The Great John's men pursued, scattering them across the snowy plain. Robb, still on the rampart near Catelyn, turned to the Great Hall's courtyard. Open the gate further, let me ride out with reinforcements. The gate creaked. Another 30 mounted men poured out, led by Meej Mormont's older daughter, Daisy. They galloped to join the Great John. Robb looked poised to follow, but Catelyn caught his arm. Let them do it. You must remain to command the defense if something goes awry. He clenched his jaw, torn. Very well. But be ready to close the gate if enemy reinforcements appear. The swirling confrontation outside soon became a rout. Over the next hour, watchers saw pockets of Bolton men attempt to flee, some heading south along the road, others simply deserting. The Greyjoy's cavalry hunted them while the foot archers kept up harassing fire. Tents burned. The ring of steel subsided to scattered shouts. Finally, as midday light washed over the churned snow, the Greyjoy's riders returned. They herded a line of prisoners, battered and shivering, roped together. At least a dozen were in flayed man uniforms, some wearing ill-fitting Lannister cloaks. The Greyjoy himself had a gash on his forehead but roared with laughter as he entered the gate. "We caught them with their pants down," he crowed to Robb, dismounting heavily. Bolton's men were in the midst of a mutiny. Seems they'd had enough starving and freezing. The traitors turned on each other. "We found Roos's banner but never caught the man himself. He fled with a handful. Meade arrived soon after, escorting more prisoners. One claims Bolton's forces had run out of food. Some wanted to kill him or desert back to the Dread Fort. Others insisted on waiting for Tywin's rescue. They ended up brawling." She spat. "A sorry lot." Robb surveyed the captured men, expression cold. "We'll question them. See if they know Bolton's whereabouts." Catelyn lingered near the gate, stunned that the siege might break so abruptly. Could it truly be that Bolton's cunning plan had unraveled under Winter's harshness and fractious leadership? The possibility made her heart lift. She followed Robb as he questioned a handful of captives. One turned out to be a Lannister man-at-arms, presumably one of the few that Tywin had spared to aid Bolton. Gone from hunger, he knelt in the snow, shivering. "We had no supplies for weeks," he moaned. "Bolton promised us an easy victory, said the walls were half ruined. Then the storms came. No reinforcements. Half our men deserted each night. We had no choice but to try and assault or starve. Then folk started killing each other for bread." The Greyjoy snorted. "Serve you right, wretches." The man hung his head. "Roose Bolton left at dawn, took a few loyal knights. He knew we'd lost. He said he was heading for the Dread Fort or maybe south to find Tywin's men. He left us to die." Robb's eyes blazed with a mixture of triumph and lingering anger. "If that's so, your siege is ended." He sent them away under guard, instructing men to keep them locked and fed meagerly until a formal judgment could be made. Some in the yard demanded the heads of these traitors, but Robb insisted on waiting. For all they knew, a diplomatic exchange might be needed later. Hostages had their uses. By late afternoon, the battlefield beyond Winterfell lay eerily silent. Tents still smoldered. Crows circled overhead. Searching parties from the castle found scattered bodies, some half buried by snow drifts. The swirl of footprints showed chaos and flight. No cohesive enemy force remained. In the Great Hall, the mood soared. Soldiers recounted the cavalry charge, how the Greyjoy hacked apart men left and right, how Meade's spears pinned the enemy in confusion. A sense of relief spread, for the dreaded siege was undone by its own internal strife. Still, a note of caution lingered. Roose Bolton himself had escaped, presumably with a small retinue. That meant the root of the betrayal remained unpunished. As darkness fell, Robb and his closest allies gathered by the main hearth in the Great Hall, feasting on the best meal they could muster. Roast venison from a successful hunt, onions, bread, and a small cask of ale. The men ate ravenously, toasting the end of Bolton's immediate threat. Catelyn sat near Robb, sharing in the moment of relief. The Greyjoy boomed out a half-drunken speech about the unstoppable might of House Stark, how they'd broken Walder Frey, Tywin Lannister, and now Roose Bolton's siege. Raucous cheers followed. And yet, when the cheering subsided, Robb's face turned solemn. He stood, raising a cup to the assembly. "We rejoice tonight, but let us not forget those who fell. Let us not forget that Roose Bolton still lurks at large. We hold Winterfell, yet the realm remains unsteady. The Lannisters are not finished, nor is the war done. But for now," he lifted his cup. "We have proven the wolves of Winterfell cannot be driven out so easily. The North endures. The North endures," the men shouted, clanking mugs, pounding tables. Catelyn's gaze strayed to the dark corners of the hall, imagining how Ned would have reacted, quietly satisfied, caution tempered by pride in his people. She breathed a small prayer of thanks. Another mortal threat had come and gone, leaving House Stark battered but unbroken. In the days that followed, the defenders emerged into the now empty siege lines, trudging through drifts to gather what salvage they could, half-rotten crates, some weapons, half-burned tents. They found no sign of a hidden secondary force. Indeed, it seemed Bolton's entire plan hinged on either a quick victory or surviving until Tywin's reinforcement. Winter's severity and the defenders' stubbornness had undone him. Prisoners trickled in, stragglers who had hidden in the woods, freezing and hungry, surrendering themselves at Winterfell's gates. Most were foot soldiers who swore they'd had enough of Bolton and just wanted to live. Robb had them penned in a corner of the courtyard, guarded day and night. As for Bolton, fresh rumors drifted in from travelers. He was riding for the Dreadfort, or had vanished into the snows, or had turned south. No one knew for certain. Ultimately, though, House Stark held its seat. Winterfell stood. The battered fortress was still far from whole, but with the siege ended, repairs could resume in earnest. Scouts were sent to the outlying villages to reassure them that the siege was lifted. Some farmers and small folk, having fled during the Ironborn occupation, began returning, albeit cautiously. A few also reported seeing Bolton men traveling east or crossing the White Knife. No consistent story emerged. One bright day, almost a month after the siege's collapse, Catelyn walked the ramparts with Robb. Snow glittered in the midday sun, and a crisp wind stirred her hair. The parapets had been refortified, the rubble partially cleared away. Soldiers in good spirits patrolled. Below, in the courtyard, the Great John oversaw an archery drill, bellowing advice at novices. Opposite them, stonemasons hauled heavy blocks to patch cracks in the curtain wall. Winterfell was, at last, beginning to look less like a ruin and more like a castle under restoration. Catelyn stopped at a vantage point overlooking the southwestern approach, scene of the enemy's final assault. "We've come so far," she murmured. "From Harrenhal, the twins, Riverrun, now here. And still we stand." Robb's expression warmed. "Yes, we remain, and we'll keep fighting, until our home is truly safe. Until Bolton's threat is gone and the Lannisters no longer menace us." She touched his arm. "One day, we may even see peace." He gazed over the fields, half lost in thought. "If Sansa is truly escaped from King's Landing, I'd hope she might find her way north. If Arya's out there, or Bran and Rickon, we must do all we can. But for now, rebuilding is our focus." She nodded. "We'll do it together." In the yard, a familiar figure strode into view. Asha Greyjoy, flanked by guards, allowed a bit of exercise in the open air. She glanced up at the walls, perhaps noting Robb and Catelyn watching her. Asha gave a slight, sober nod, then continued walking. She'd proven cooperative enough, and with the siege ended, she might have less leverage than she'd hoped. Still, she had not tried to escape. Perhaps she waited to see if the North's victory might yield an opportunity for the Ironborn to leave. "What will you do with her?" Catelyn asked quietly. Robb shrugged. "Hold her for now. If it's true that some Ironborn remain along the coast, her letters might persuade them to depart. We can't be sure, but it costs us little to keep her locked up. If we gain peace on that front, good." Catelyn accepted that. She turned again to gaze over the expanse beyond the gate. The snow-laden fields were dotted with half-burned remnants of Bolton's camp, which had now been cleared away in large part, leaving lumps of charred debris. A handful of crows hopped about, picking at the remains. No sign of a threat lingered there, not anymore. In time, the day would come for House Stark to strike beyond these walls, maybe to retake the Dreadfort if Bolton tried to hold it, or to repel any further Lannister intrigue from the south. But for now, they savored the unexpected boon of a battered but successful defense. The Red Wedding had not undone them. Tywin's cunning had not undone them. And Roose Bolton's winter siege had ended in self-destruction. That evening, a subdued celebration took place in the Great Hall. Music was sparse, only a pair of fiddles and a drum battered from the Ironborn occupation, but men clapped in time, stamping feet on the flagstones. They dined on roast goose hunted from the Wolfswood, along with precious root vegetables found in the old cellars. The portion was meager, but the spirit was not. Cups were raised to the king in the north, to the memory of Ned Stark, to the resilience of the North as a whole. As the night wore on, men took turns telling war stories. The Greyjoy's boisterous recounting of the rout of Bolton's camp drew cheers, while Meage Mormont added wry commentary about how half the traitors seemed ready to slit each other's throats. Robb, somewhat more reserved, occasionally managed a slight smile when men toasted his name, but it was clear the burdens of leadership still weighed heavily. At one point, Ser Wendell Manderly proposed a toast to Catelyn, praising her steady hand through the war's darkest hours, including Harrenhal and the near disaster of the Red Wedding. She felt her cheeks warm. She was not used to such accolades, but the men pounded their mugs, chanting her name. In their eyes, she had become a figure of maternal fortitude, the mother wolf who stood guard at her son's side. She rose and murmured thanks, voice trembling with emotion. Eventually, the hall emptied into a hush broken by gentle snores. Soldiers and lesser knights bedded down on the floor or stumbled off to battered chambers. A hush of contentment permeated the old walls. For a time, at least, the shadow of immediate war had lifted. Outside, the wind rattled, but it was gentler now, more reminiscent of a lullaby than a threat. Dawn found the courtyard covered by yet another layer of snow, pure and pristine. It seemed to Catelyn like an apt symbol, a new canvas upon which House Stark would paint its future. War still lurked in the realm, but for the present, Winterfell stood unbesieged. Robb rose early, calling men to muster in the yard, organizing fresh patrols. The Great John rubbed his hands in the cold, grumbling about the lack of mead, but volunteering to lead a group of outriders to ensure no stray Bolton pockets remained. Meage Mormont said she'd dispatch a few of her best trackers. The day buzzed with a sense of direction. Catelyn climbed a half-rebuilt tower to watch them depart. A line of riders forging westward, vanish into the snowy horizon. She exhaled, letting a pang of hope settle in her chest. The king in the north had once again repelled destruction. House Stark had weathered betrayal, faced the might of the Lannisters, ended Walder Frey's ambitions, and now broken Roose Bolton's siege. Farther down the tower, near a window, a swirl of movement caught her eye. Asha Greyjoy, under guard, gazing out at the same horizon. Something in her posture suggested resignation, but also a faint, grudging respect. Perhaps even the Ironborn woman recognized that the wolves of Winterfell were not easily broken. Catelyn turned her gaze from Asha to the open sky. Snow drifted gently, the bright morning light glinting on each flake. She thought of Ned, of how he would stand here and watch the storms roll in, unwavering. Robb carried that same unwavering determination. So did the Northern Lords who had survived heartbreak after heartbreak. One day, she told herself, we will see the North fully at peace, free of these terrors. One day, the missing children may return, and Sansa will be freed from the Lannisters' shadow. One day, the ghosts of the Red Wedding, of Harrenhal, of Moat Cailin, will fade. But for the moment, it was enough to know that Roose Bolton's last gambit had failed and that Winterfell belonged to House Stark once more. The sun continued its slow climb, illuminating the courtyard, the old walls, the men and women moving with renewed purpose. The wind's howl softened to a whisper, as if the land itself breathed a momentary sigh of relief. In that pale winter sunlight, battered towers and all, Winterfell stood as a testament to the unyielding spirit of the North. A living fortress shaped by war yet refusing to fall. Such was the legacy of the wolves who had turned every betrayal into their enemy's undoing, forging hope out of ruin again and again. And as Catelyn closed her eyes, taking in the crisp air, she silently prayed that, if the realm insisted on testing House Stark once more, it would find the wolves ready. Teeth bared, heart steady, and unbreakable in the face of any new storm. Winter still clutched the North in an icy fist, even though Bolton's siege of Winterfell had collapsed in disarray. Out beyond the walls, snowdrifts covered the wreckage of the abandoned camp, smoothing the land as though to wipe away the memory of the traitor's presence. Yet no amount of snow could efface the deeper scars, the blood spilled on the southwestern breach, the men lost in desperate fighting, the echoes of horns in the night. In the minds of every northerner in Winterfell, Roose Bolton's treachery still festered like an unhealed wound. They had survived his siege, but he remained at large, a threat lurking somewhere in the great expanse of the north or even beyond it. King Robb Stark was not a man to take triumph for granted. He knew from hard experience that each victory in this war was precarious. Half-measures and false dawns had dogged House Stark ever since Ned Stark traveled south to serve as Hand of the King, never to return. Robb had stood in Harrenhal, the Twins, and Riverrun, each time outfoxing or outlasting foes who might have destroyed him. He had watched Walder Frey's plot collapse, he had broken Tywin Lannister's host in the fields outside Riverrun, and he had just driven Roose Bolton from the gates of Winterfell. But the realm was not at peace, nor would it be anytime soon. Let Bolton skulk through the snowfields or the pinewoods, so long as he could rally men or strike new bargains, House Stark could not rest. Even so, in the days after the siege's collapse, Winterfell eased from frantic war footing into a determined regimen of rebuilding. The battered fortress had been half-ruined by Theon Greyjoy's occupation and subsequent destruction. Then Bolton's attacks had forced them to shore up the southwestern breach with makeshift barricades of rubble and timber. Now, with the threat receding into the frozen countryside, King Robb wanted those breaches properly sealed. He wanted the ring wall rebuilt, the gatehouse restored to something resembling strength, and the battered turrets and parapets brought back to life. That effort demanded manpower, timber, stone, and above all, time, none of which the North had in abundance. Still, the castle bustled. Masons in heavy cloaks clambered over stone piles, cursing the cold. Smiths hammered out nails and hinges in the half-repaired forge, struggling to keep fires hot enough to shape metal. Workers from scattered villages began drifting back, though each new arrival wore hollow eyes and threadbare clothes, bearing stories of bandit raids or old farms gone to ruin. These men and women came in search of protection from the king in the north or from the good name of House Stark. Robb accepted them all so long as they could help, a pair of strong shoulders, a willingness to haul rock or chop wood, anything to aid Winterfell in rising from its ashes. Each dawn, Robb rose early to ride the circuit of the fortress, conferring with stonemasons, checking the gatehouse, ensuring archers drilled on the walls. Though the siege was lifted, watch duty remained essential. No one knew if Bolton might try again or if Tywin Lannister, somewhere in the southern chaos, would decide to dispatch reinforcements. But the men on duty carried themselves with renewed pride. There was a sense that House Stark had passed yet another deadly test. That under these broken towers a strong heart still beat. Catelyn Stark often accompanied her son in his rounds, or else she roamed alone, seeing to the less martial side of command. She organized healing for the wounded, arranged new sleeping quarters for families returning to the safety of the castle, and oversaw the distribution of what scant winter stores they still had. Lines grew around the storehouses each morning, villagers and outliers hoping for a morsel of bread. The meager harvest from the glass gardens scarcely kept pace with demand, so every measure of oats or salted fish was precious. Yet she insisted that no one starve, that the Starks remain known as protectors of their own. If Tywin or Bolton believed hunger would snap the castle's resolve, they had gravely misjudged. Most afternoons, once her immediate duties were done, Catelyn visited the old Godwood. Hot springs still coursed beneath that corner of Winterfell, and the snow melted around the roots of the ancient heart tree. At first, she would kneel, murmuring prayers to the carved face in the weirwood, asking the old gods to watch over her missing children. She prayed for Sansa, rumored to have vanished from King's Landing after Joffrey's demise. She prayed for Arya, last known to be lost somewhere in the Riverlands or the war-torn countryside. She prayed for Bran and Rickon, believed dead but, by Theon's own likely lies, perhaps still alive in the wide, wild north. It was in the hush of the Godwood that her grief surfaced, a slow ache that clenched her chest. There had been no sign, no new rumor, nothing. Only the faint hope that if they lived, they might find their way home. On one such afternoon, as she rose from the damp moss, she heard the crunch of boots. Robb emerged from a swirl of steam, gray wind padding beside him. He came to stand next to her, regarding the weirwood's solemn face. He spoke quietly. "I came to pray as well." She nodded. "We have much to hope for." He bent to touch the bark, letting his gloved hand trace the carved line of eyes. "The war is not done, Mother. I feel as though every time I turn around, a new menace waits." She slipped an arm around his shoulders, mindful of his ever-present tension. "Perhaps the storms will die down long enough for us to press an advantage. If the roads clear come spring, then Tywin might march or Roose might gather men at the Drevfort," he replied, voice grim. "But we'll be stronger then, too." She could offer no perfect reassurance. She only knew they had endured beyond all reason so far. Let that be a sign. The two of them turned away, back toward the castle yard. They passed the remains of the training grounds, half smoothed by snowfall, then stepped through a side door into the cramped corridors. The wind whistled behind them, as if reluctant to let them go. In the yard, a small crowd had gathered, swirling with excitement. The Great John, that towering figure of unstoppable boisterousness, was at the center, brandishing a spear. He was in the midst of describing to a cluster of younger soldiers how he had cleaved a Bolton knight's shield in half during the final sally. Men erupted in laughter at his gory humor. Off to the side, Ser Wendell Manderly stood with a more sober posture, speaking to two scouts who had just returned from the fields west of Winterfell. When the Great John saw Robb, he roared a greeting. "Ho, my king! Have you heard? These scouts say old Bolton was seen crossing the White Knife a fortnight past, heading to the Dreadfort if you believe rumor. Robb joined them, exchanging a look with Ser Wendell. Is this confirmed? One scout, a lean man with a streak of gray in his hair, nodded. A villager up by the White Knife swears Bolton and a handful of riders came through at dusk, paying with Lannister silver for fresh horses. Another rumor claims a band wearing the Flayed Man sigil was glimpsed on the outskirts of the Dreadfort. Could be they arrived, or maybe it's more of his scattered forces. Catelyn felt a twinge of dismay. So the traitor had likely slipped away to the Dreadfort after all. But the Great John only spat into the snow. Let him cower in his fortress. We can tear it down once we muster enough men. The Dreadfort's no match for the entire north. Not if the Manderleys, Umbers, and Starks come at it together. Robb crossed his arms, brow furrowed. A siege of the Dreadfort in deep winter would be as miserable for us as for them. We only just endured a siege ourselves, but we cannot leave him to gather fresh allies. If we wait until spring, Tywin might have time to coordinate with him again. Ser Wendell offered a half-bow. My father, Lord Wyman, will do what he can from White Harbor to cut off Bolton's supply lines by the river. But winter's iced over many routes. We can't easily float an army up the White Knife. Nor can we safely march a massive host across the snows. We might lose half the men to cold. The Great John grumbled in frustration. Then he gave a shrug. We bide our time, or we send a small party to harass him. The question is whether we risk more men on a partial attack. They talked it through, though no perfect solution emerged. The Great John was a man of action, longing to crush Bolton outright. Robb, though capable of bold moves, had learned caution. The Dreadfort was notoriously grim. Storming it, especially in a season of harsh cold, might cost them dearly. With Winterfell still in partial ruin, any large expedition could leave them vulnerable if Tywin's minions arrived. In the end, Robb decided to wait, relying on watchers in the region to track Bolton's movements. If the traitor truly hunkered down in his fortress, House Stark would strike at a more opportune time. Meanwhile, the daily routine at Winterfell continued to revolve around reconstruction, rationing, and readiness. With the siege ended, hunts began venturing farther into the Wolfswood, though the game was thin this late in the season. The Great Hall was less crowded at night, as those who could manage it found smaller chambers or newly cleared rooms to sleep in. Yet some soldiers still preferred the communal warmth, lying close to the braziers with wolfskin cloaks drawn around them. Amid these rhythms, Asha Greyjoy's presence lingered like an odd riddle. She had been allowed short, guarded walks in the yard, and one or two brief appearances at mealtimes, always flanked by watchers. Most men looked at her with hostility or suspicion, recalling Theon's betrayal or the Ironborn's raids along the coast. She met such glares with a stiff spine. No one doubted her skill or her pride, but with the Ironborn scattering for a kingsmoot after Balon Greyjoy's death, her own future was uncertain. If she had any illusions of escaping, she hid them well. She simply told those who asked that she was done with Euron Crow's eye and his madness, that she wanted no further part in the Ironborn's attempts to seize land in the north. She repeated her vow that if the Ironborn still lingered anywhere near the stony shore, they might heed her letters urging them to depart for good. One frosty morning, Catelyn emerged into the yard to see Asha standing near a corner of the training square, arms folded, watching men practice with wooden swords. The guards at her side kept a respectful distance but hovered. Intrigued, Catelyn crossed the churned snow to greet her. Asha inclined her head, expression wary. "My lady," the Ironborn woman said, "you look well enough this morning." Catelyn studied her. "How fare you, Captain Greyjoy? Or do you prefer we not use that title?" Asha's mouth quirked. "I was once a captain, yes. Now I'm a prisoner, or a guest, depending on the day. I keep waiting to see if your son will decide to execute me." Catelyn sighed. "That's not his intent, so long as you remain cooperative. You said you no longer stand with the Ironborn who fight us. If that's true, you have nothing to fear." Asha gave a shrug. "I suppose not. I only wish I could know if my letters reached any of my father's captains. If they did, perhaps they've left your shores. If not, you'll see more reaving in the spring. It would be wise for them to heed your counsel, Catelyn said, voice quiet. The North has endured too much pillaging. Then, more softly, what do you plan for yourself if the Ironborn truly withdraw? Asha seemed momentarily caught off guard. She glanced at the swirling snow. I'd sail away, if your king lets me, to some corner of the seas far from Euron's reach. Or perhaps I'd remain your hostage if you think that's safer. My father's legacy is in tatters. I have no illusions that I can unify the Iron Islands. Let them tear each other apart. Catelyn heard the bitterness in her words and felt a flicker of unexpected sympathy. War had sundered many families, and Asha seemed another casualty. Well, you have a place here for now. A shadow of a sardonic smile touched Asha's lips. Yes, quite the place. Watching your men swing wooden swords. Still, I suppose it's better than starving in a cell. Though Asha's tone was irreverent, Catelyn sensed no immediate threat. She dipped her head and left the woman to her brooding. The guards, of course, did not leave. They would ensure Asha's captivity remained secure, at least until the king in the north decided otherwise. Later that same day, trumpets sounded from the main gate. A hush fell over the yard. Men readied crossbows, suspecting a fresh threat. But the gate swung open to reveal not an enemy but a company of White Harbor riders. Their cloaks dusted with ice, the merman sigil on their pennants. At their head was Ser Marlon Manderly, a cousin to Wyman Manderly. He dismounted stiffly, his breath pluming in the cold. "Your Grace," he called to Robb, who hurried out from inside. "I bring greetings from my Lord Father, who has dispatched us with supply wagons, salted fish, grain, and some casks of good White Harbor beer." A faint smile touched his weary face. "It's not a king's feast, but better than nothing." Relief swept the courtyard. Winterfell's stores had been running perilously low, and even salted fish was a welcome boon. Robb thanked Ser Marlon warmly, had the wagons directed to the storehouses, and invited him to a meal by the brazier. Over bowls of hot onion broth, they discussed the wider realm. Wyman Manderly, it seemed, had done what he could to keep White Harbor's trade routes open even under winter conditions. Merchants were few and far between, but at least there was some commerce. No sign of Lannister war galleys along the eastern coast. Apparently Tywin's navy, such as it was too busy patrolling the waters near the Crownlands. Or so rumor went. When conversation turned to Roose Bolton, Ser Marlon's expression soured. "We suspect he's holed up in the Dreadfort, yes, or perhaps skulking around it. He's been sending out riders to neighboring lands. Some folks come to White Harbor telling tales of demands for tribute or forced conscription. So far, he hasn't marched on us, but we keep an eye on the roads. Should he attempt a siege of White Harbor, we'll hold. We have strong walls too." Robb frowned. "I don't doubt your defenses, but I wonder what scheme Bolton might be planning. If he's scouring for men, perhaps he's trying to replace the ones who deserted or died at Winterfell. He might attempt to bide his time until Tywin sends him gold or soldiers in the spring." Ser Marlon nodded. "Indeed. My father recommended we remain vigilant. If you decide to move on the Dreadfort, White Harbor stands ready to assist, though the snow complicates large-scale movements. We can't promise a swift march." The talk continued well into the evening. When Ser Marlon rose to retire, he pressed Robb's hand, repeating his father's vow of loyalty. For all the trials House Stark had endured, the Manderlys remained staunchly in their corner. As the torches in the hall guttered low, men parted ways in a sense of grim solidarity. The North might be scattered, battered, starved, but it was still united under the direwolf banner, unwilling to yield to fear or betrayal. That night, as Catelyn prepared for what she hoped would be a quiet sleep, she found she could not rest. Memories and anxieties jostled in her mind. She thought of her younger boys, Bran and Rickon, and the possibility that they might wander somewhere in that very snow, or have found shelter with allies. Asha's words about Theon faking their deaths came back to her, stoking a slender hope. She wished for news, any news, no matter how small, but none had arrived. Instead, she had only the knowledge that half the realm believed them slain. Eventually, she rose and roamed the corridors, stopping now and then to peer into half-rebuilt chambers. Most of Winterfell's inhabitants were asleep or resting in the Great Hall, lulled by the meager warmth of fires. She felt like a spirit drifting through the halls. Flickers of torchlight revealed the rough patches in the walls, the new timbers hammered into place, the old banners rehung to give the keep a vestige of its former dignity. Through a crack in the shutters, she glimpsed the courtyard dusted with moonlit snow. All was calm out there, no horns, no shouts. A lull in the storm indeed. In her wandering, she passed the door to the library tower, where volunteers by day sorted through charred scrolls. It was closed and dark now, so she moved on. She paused by a corridor that once led to the old maester's turret, remembering how Maester Luwin had taught her children in that round room. Bran had loved listening to the maester's histories. Rickon had mostly fidgeted with the direwolves at his feet. But now Luwin was dead, and the children scattered. She felt tears sting her eyes, so she pressed on, letting the memory slip away. She had to remain strong. At last she returned to her chamber, finding it as cold as before. She slipped under the furs, stared at the ceiling, and waited out the long night. Winter might last another year or more, as Northerners often reminded each other. But House Stark would not break under it. That promise beat in her chest like a vow from her wedding day. With every sunrise, the settlement around Winterfell grew a bit more stable. Each time a group of villagers arrived, Robb or Catelyn listened to their woes and assigned them tasks. Some brought glimpses of normalcy, a traveling smith from Barrowton, or a goat herder who had trudged across farmland to see if the rumors of Winterfell's revival were true. The goat herder, a wiry man with a bright-eyed daughter, offered goat cheese in trade for partial shelter. He was stunned to receive a place by the outer courtyard stables. "It's more than we had," he said in trembling gratitude. The child simply gazed wide-eyed at the battered towers as though they were the apex of wonder. Even the notion of wonder had begun to seep back into Winterfell's stone. Men with time on their hands patched decorative arches, hammered old beams into shape so that corridors grew less precarious. Some younger soldiers, lacking much to do, cleared out a small portion of the training yard for sparring in the afternoons. Others gathered scraps of wood to keep the great hall's braziers alive. No one expected a grand feast, but the small gatherings at night, with simple fare and soft conversation, replaced the anxiety that once reigned. The direwolf banner hung over the dais, an icon of resilience. Still, the threat from the dread fort gnawed at them. Bolton's flight left unfinished business. The Greatjon insisted daily on launching a new campaign, though the deep snows made any large march a folly. Asha Greyjoy wisecracked that if they wanted someone cunning enough to slip into the dread fort with a small sabotage crew, she might volunteer, except that no one would trust her not to vanish the moment she was free of Winterfell. Men responded to her sardonic offer with jeers, and she only smirked back. In private, Catelyn wondered if infiltration was an option at all. The Dreadfort had dungeons rumored to be labyrinthine. If Bolton kept a guard of devout loyalists, infiltration might be suicidal. In the midst of these discussions, word arrived from the Riverlands, an unexpected raven from Riverrun, bearing the seal of Edmure Tully. Catelyn and Robb read it together in the half-rebuilt Solar. Its contents conveyed that Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, was keeping watch on Lannister movements near the Golden Tooth. A path forward, some genuine arrangement or alliance that might help the North. Robb might consider negotiating your release eventually. Asha's eyes flickered. Alliance? I don't see the Ironborn forging alliances with the North, not after Theon's fiasco and my father's war. Unless you mean me personally? I'm not a house by myself, my lady. Catelyn considered. True, yet you remain a voice. If this Kingsmoot yields a victor who wants to raid us again, you might persuade them otherwise. The Ironborn woman gave a half-laugh. You overestimate my influence, I suspect, but if it keeps me alive, I'll vow to discourage future raids. Might be the best I can do. They parted without further resolution, though Catelyn felt a small sense that Asha was not wholly uninterested in forging some kind of bargain. War made strange bedfellows. She only hoped it never came to needing that bond. If the Ironborn stayed away, so much the better. Spring's early whisper arrived at last, with the streams trickling and the wind less savage. Scouts ventured forth to test the roads, finding some still blocked but others passable. Caravans might soon travel the King's Road more freely. The daily hunts yielded slightly more game, animals beginning to stir from winter torpor. A sense of possibility hovered over Winterfell. The Great John grinned as he patrolled the yard, promising that once the mud dried, they could muster a grand host to scour the dread fort. Men hammered away at the southwestern breach, nearly completing a new section of wall. Even the battered gatehouse showed improvement, with fresh timbers in place. The fortress looked more like Winterfell of old, though many towers were still blackened or partially collapsed. One crisp morning, Catelyn was on the ramparts when she spotted a line of riders approaching. The sun caught on their armor, turning it bright. At first, her heart lurched. An enemy? But the Watchers soon called that they bore the sigil of House Cerwyn, one of the smaller northern houses loyal to the Starks. The gates opened, and in they rode, a cluster of some 30 men with a man in battered plate at the lead. She recognized him vaguely, Lord Medgar Cerwyn's cousin or nephew, she thought. Or perhaps the Lord himself, though she remembered hearing of his death. War had changed so many faces. Robb came to greet them in the yard. The lead rider dismounted, knelt, and introduced himself as Jory Cerwyn, nephew to the late lord. He'd come bearing news. House Cerwyn's lands had endured some harassment from Bolton's men, but they'd fended them off. More importantly, Jory declared loyalty and offered a small retinue to help defend Winterfell. When the road's clear, we can bring more, he said. We stand with the king in the north. The arrival of these Cerwyn men was a welcome sign that the north still rallied behind House Stark despite the terrors of the last year. It heartened many to see them share bread and ale with the Great John and others in the Great Hall. Their presence reminded everyone that, with Bolton discredited, the rest of the North's houses would likely gather to the Stark banner if war flared again. That evening, the talk in the hall turned hopeful. Perhaps come the thaw, House Mormont would return from Bear Island, House Glover would muster from Deepwood Motte, the Umbers from Last Hearth, the Manderleys from White Harbor, and so forth, forming a mighty host. With that, they could at last march on the Drev Fort, end Roose Bolton's treachery, and unify the North in truth. Then, if Tywin threatened them anew, they would have a stable homeland from which to fight. Men lifted cups, toasting the future. Robb, though still cautious, allowed a small, genuine smile at the sight of so much optimism. Catelyn took her own seat near the dais, sipping watered wine. She recalled how many storms they had weathered to reach this point. When the mood of the hall lifted, it felt almost like the days before the War of the Five Kings, those simpler times. If she closed her eyes, she could almost imagine Ned sitting beside her, Sansa and Arya bickering softly, Bran pestering them with questions about knights, Rickon playing with Shaggy Dog under the table. Almost, she forced the image away so as not to break down in front of these men, most of whom had their own losses. On the dais, near Robb's right hand, sat the Great John, cheeks flushed with ale. Jory Cerwyn recounted how House Cerwyn had retaken some farmland near an old watchtower. Men in the hall cheered. Ser Wendell Manderley proposed to coordinate supply lines with them. All around, conversation buzzed with the possibility of truly rebuilding. More than once, she heard men speak of when we finish with Bolton or once we are free of that Leech Lord. They spoke as though his downfall were inevitable. Yet inside her, a cautious voice whispered that wars seldom concluded so cleanly. Bolton had proven cunning. He might die in some folly or vanish altogether, but equally he might orchestrate one last betrayal. She prayed they would see him undone for good. But if the last year had taught her anything, it was never to underestimate the cruelty men could unleash if cornered. As the night wore on, some took to singing. A fiddler strummed a northern ballad and men slapped their knees in time, though the tune was bittersweet, describing how the North overcame cold and sorrow. Catelyn watched Robb rise and slip from the hall, gray wind at his heels. She decided to follow quietly after a moment, giving him space until she found him near the courtyard, gazing at the southwestern breach. He did not turn when she stepped up beside him, but she sensed his tension. Finally, he spoke. "We nearly lost everything here, Mother. If the siege had gone differently, if Bolton had better discipline or more men, maybe we'd be huddled in ashes again or executed. It's unsettling how close we teeter." She rubbed his shoulder gently. "We've always been close to the edge, Robb, yet we've endured. Each time, you found a way." He exhaled the faintest of pain smiles. "But the cost grows. Our men die, more families suffer. I want to see an end. Once we destroy Bolton, can we truly be free of this war?" She took a moment before answering. "We can only try. Tywin might still strike. The Iron Throne remains in Lannister hands. Sansa is still lost. But the home front would be safe. That's something." He nodded. "Yes. A start. Then maybe, if the gods are kind, we can help Edmure push south. Or perhaps the realm will devour itself in King's Landing, leaving us in peace." A hush enfolded them, the night air laced with spring's faint promise. She could hear a drip of meltwater from the repaired stone overhead. The war might still blaze in corners of Westeros, but for this moment Winterfell stood calm under the moonlight. "Whatever tomorrow brings," she said softly, "we stand as one. The North remembers." He repeated the old words, "The North remembers." They lingered there, mother and son, two survivors of heartbreak who had turned a slaughter meant for them into a string of improbable victories. Walder Frey's downfall at the Twins, Tywin's defeat at Riverrun, Bolton's collapse at Winterfell. Soon, they would confront the final remnants of betrayal in their homeland, gathering the allied houses to see justice done. In the morning, fresh crows flapped around the towers, their calls echoing as though they, too, sensed the shift in the seasons. Men rose early to resume repairs. The southwestern breach was now almost indistinguishable from the main wall, skillfully integrated by the masons' dogged labor. The Greyjoy supervised a group testing the gatehouse portcullis, raising and lowering it with a satisfying rattle of chains. Robb oversaw archers drilling in the yard. Catelyn walked among the stable hands, ensuring they had feed for the horses, mindful that come spring, the demands for cavalry would intensify. In a corner of the yard, Asha Greyjoy quietly exercised with a dull-edged sword, the shackles limiting her movements. A young guard stood by with a watchful eye. She struck at a wooden post, footwork precise despite the constraints. A stray dog barked at her from a distance, and she bared her teeth in a wry grin as if acknowledging the life she led, a caged warrior practicing for fights she would not soon undertake. When she noticed Catelyn's glance, she gave a faint nod, then resumed her drills. It was as if she refused to let her skills rust, even in captivity. Later that day, Robb held a short session of court. Among the petitioners was a trio of peasants from a nearby hamlet, seeking redress for fields scorched by a small Bolton foraging party 2 months back. Robb heard their pleas solemnly, promised them a small portion of seed grain from Winterfell's stores and the right to gather wood from the castle's domain for rebuilding. The peasants seemed relieved, bowing profusely. The sight touched Catelyn's heart. Here was the meaning of rulership, of a king's duty to his people, overshadowed by grand battles though it might be. Toward the evening, an uproar spread in the yard. Scouts were returning from a new foray north, near the edges of the Wolfswood, and they brought unexpected company. A gaggle of ragged travelers, 2 men and a woman, half-frozen, eyes darting in fear. The watchers parted for them, guiding them into the courtyard with cautious curiosity. Robb arrived with the Greyjoy, swords at their sides. Catelyn joined soon after, her breath catching at the possibility that it might be more refugees from Bolton's cruelty or some new twist. One man stepped forward, bowing. His face was gaunt, cheeks hollow with hunger. He introduced himself as Hallis from a northern hamlet near the upper flanks of the Wolfswood. "We come seeking shelter," he said, "and to warn you, we saw something in the forest. Bodies. Wolves. Couldn't say if it was bandits or something worse, but we fled." Robb exchanged a glance with the Greyjoy. "Bandits near your hamlet?" The woman, pale and trembling, piped up. "Could be. Or Bolton's men. Or anything. The snows are melting, my lord, and the roads grow treacherous with mud. We found a place where the snow had thawed enough to reveal corpses, 4 or 5, wearing scraps of Bolton's livery. They'd been savaged by beasts, or so it looked." Her eyes brimmed with horror. "We heard howling." A hush fell. Wolves in the Wolfswood were not surprising, but men wearing Bolton's colors, half-eaten, might suggest some group had ventured or deserted. The Greyjoy rubbed his beard. They got what they deserved if they were traitors. But still, best we check if more roam that area. Robb nodded. "We'll send a small scouting party. In the meantime, you 3 can remain under our protection if you wish. We have little to spare, but will not turn you away." He gestured for them to be escorted into the keep, offered bread and a warm place by the fire. Grateful tears slid down their cheeks. Later that night, the Greyjoy led a handful of riders out to confirm the rumor. They returned 2 days afterward, confirming they'd found scattered remains indeed, men in flayed man garb, apparently fallen to wolves. "No sign of survivors," the Greyjoy said with a certain grim satisfaction. "Seems the bastard of Bolton's men got lost or deserted only to meet the real wolves out there." That rumor carried a certain poetic justice in the eyes of Winterfell's defenders, House Bolton undone by actual wolves in the forest. Men told the story at mealtime with savage glee, though Robb cautioned them not to revel in gore. Every death in these times was a product of war's endless churn. But it did highlight the slow unraveling of Bolton's once proud cause. Deserters, disarray, rumors of violence from within. The traitor might still lurk at the Drev fort, but his men were no legion. The day might come when the North marched to end him with minimal bloodshed. All these tidings knitted together a sense that House Stark's hour of reckoning might be near. Spring advanced further, the snows receding in patches, bearing the dead grass beneath. Ice cracked in the moat around the walls. Stonemasons finished the southwestern wall's repairs, declared it stout enough to repel a new siege. A battered sense of triumph spread among the workers. One sunny afternoon, Robb walked that rampart with Catelyn, marveling at the fresh mortar and the properly set stones. "It's not perfect," he said, running a hand along the newly joined seam, "but it's strong. Strong enough, I hope, for any threat." She reached out, feeling the roughness of newly hewn rock. "You've done it. You've taken a castle half-burned by Theon, hammered by Bolton's siege, and rebuilt it. Winterfell stands." His eyes glimmered. "The North stands. Let the next foe come if they must." On the horizon, buds of green speckled the distant trees, an almost incongruous sign of renewal. It felt surreal after the endless cold and violence. And yet the war remained. Beneath the swirl of daily life, men braced for the day Tywin might send an army or Bolton might attempt a final stand. The Greyjoy licked his lips at the thought of a grand muster, certain it would happen soon. But no one could say exactly when. Then, on an evening scented with thawing earth, another raven arrived, this one from White Harbor, sealed with House Manderly's crest. Robb read it in private first, then summoned his mother to the Solar, along with the Greyjoy, Wendell Manderly, and a few knights. He held the parchment, voice low as he explained. "Lord Wyman Manderly writes that travelers from the south bring news that Tywin Lannister has had a falling out with Prince Dor and Martell of Dorne. Also, rumors swirl that the crown's finances are in disarray. The crown can barely pay its armies. This might hamper any new campaign to the north. Tywin's energies appear turned inward, stabilizing Tommen's rule. It also says a band of Sellswords was spotted near Harrenhal, rumored to be seeking Bolton's coin, but no confirmation they headed north." The Greyjoy let out a bark of relief. "Good. So maybe no huge force coming up the King's Road soon." "Perhaps," Robb said, gaze thoughtful. "But that also means Bolton, if he was waiting for Tywin's support, might find it lacking. He might get desperate." Wendell Manderly spoke up. "My father stands ready. Once the road's dry, we can form a column from White Harbor to the Dreadfort. If you muster from Winterfell, we trap Bolton in his own seat. He has no allies left that matter." Catelyn saw Robb's expression shift from caution to possibility. "That may be precisely what we do. I'll consult with the Umbers, the Glovers, and any others. If we converge by early summer, we can finish this once and for all." A hum of assent filled the Solar. The Greyjoy slapped the table in excitement. "A grand host at last. We'll tear the flayed man down." Robb placed the parchment aside, nodding firmly. "Yes. I only want to confirm that we won't be undone by a second front. Tywin's troubles are in our favor. Let's seize the chance." Thus the plan took shape. In the next weeks, messages flew out to allied northern houses, urging them to prepare for a late spring muster near Winterfell or the fields east of it, from which they'd march on the Dreadfort. There was no guarantee it would be easy. War never was. But the advantage was decidedly House Stark's. With Bolton's men battered, Tywin's attention elsewhere, and the roads slowly clearing, a final confrontation loomed. As the fortress stirred with talk of war anew, Catelyn felt a swirl of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, she welcomed the chance to uproot the last traitor. On the other, war meant more blood. She thought of the men they might lose, the families sundered, the heartbreak guaranteed. Yet they could not leave Bolton free to strike again. She braced herself with the knowledge that an unsteady peace could only be made stable by removing such a threat. In that flurry of preparation, more and more northern lords arrived at Winterfell, singly or in small groups, as the roads thawed. House Flint, House Tallheart, House Glover. Representatives trickled in, each pledging men for the campaign. The courtyard filled with fresh faces, new banners fluttering in the warming wind. Catelyn greeted them all, sometimes with a word of comfort, sometimes with solemn reminders that the war would not be easily won. Still, an undercurrent of excitement laced the air, as if they stood at the verge of a great reclamation. Meanwhile, Asha Greyjoy watched from her vantage in the yard, guarded but unignored. She cocked her head at each new arrival, presumably weighing how the North coalesced around House Stark. Occasionally, men shot her hostile glares, remembering the Ironborn's earlier outrages. She responded with shrugs or sardonic half-smiles. She seemed to grasp that the tide had definitively turned. This was not the battered fortress that Theon had once seized. This was a strong seat, bristling with defenders who had survived the worst. The question for her was whether she could forge a place once the North turned its attention to other fronts. She said little, but Catelyn suspected she studied the swirl of politics with keen interest. War left no place for those unwilling to adapt. At last, with the snows mostly melted and the roads passable if still muddy, the king in the north proclaimed they would march in a fortnight. Squires polished weapons. Smiths hammered out final repairs. The great John crowed that they would tear Bolton's flayed man from the Dreadfort's gates before the moon turned twice. Midge Mormont remained absent, but her daughter Dacey, recently returned from Bear Island, promised 100 Mormont warriors soon to arrive. White Harbor's contingent was presumably mustering as well. Catelyn oversaw the final arrangements for supplies. Bread, salted meats, dried vegetables, oats for the horses. They would not starve on the short campaign if all went well. Winterfell's new stone wall was left behind with a small garrison. Robb would not strip the castle bare. The older, convalescent soldiers remained, as did many villagers and families who had come for sanctuary. This was no mass exodus, but a well-formed war band, aiming to crush Bolton swiftly and return victorious. Tensions ran high but hopeful. The day of departure dawned clear, the sky a crisp blue overhead. Trumpets sounded in the yard, echoing off the old stones. Men streamed from the keep, forming ranks with battered pride. The direwolf banner flew from a fresh-made pole, the cloth snapping in the breeze. Catelyn stood on the steps, cloaked in gray fur, gazing over the mustering lines. She spotted the great John astride a warhorse, bellowing encouragement. Dacey Mormont, tall and fierce, adjusting her shield. Ser Wendell Manderly conferring with other knights. Horses snorted, pawing at the ground. Packs and wagons were readied, hoisted with crates of supplies. The mood thrummed with expectation. Robb emerged last, gray wind at his side, wearing plate and mail beneath a thick cloak. He looked every inch the king they followed, young, stern, touched by the burdens of war, yet resolute. He strode toward his courser, pausing by Catelyn. She reached up to adjust a buckle on his breastplate, motherly instinct never quite leaving. He offered a small, wry smile. "Stay safe here, mother. I'll see you again once Bolton's no more." She inhaled a trembling breath. "I'd ride with you if it were wise, but you need me to oversee Winterfell. I'll wait for your return, proud of you always." He nodded, a flicker of emotion in his eyes. Then he embraced her briefly. Gray wind nudged her leg as though bidding farewell. Robb mounted, glancing around at the assembled men. A hush fell. Even the great John halted his boisterous chatter to give the king the moment. Robb's voice carried, "Friends, we have endured horrors to hold our home. We stand now, gathered not in fear but in strength. Today we ride to uproot the last traitor who dares defile the north. Roose Bolton thought he could break us at a wedding feast at Harrenhal at Winterfell. Each time we cast him down. Now we end his threat forever. Follow me, and together we secure the north for our children." A roar of approval thundered. Men beat sword hilts on shields. Horses tossed their heads. Catelyn felt tears burn at her eyes, overwhelmed by the moment's intensity. Robb raised his sword, steel flashing in the sunlight. Then the columns moved out, a stomping mass of hooves and boots. The gates opened, and the king in the north led them forth, banner streaming. From the parapets, watchers cheered. The old walls seemed to echo that cry, as if Winterfell itself were sending them onward. Catelyn stood on the steps until the last rider vanished beyond the gatehouse, a swirl of dust and fresh green. The great hall behind her was emptier now, so many men gone to war. She clutched her cloak tight, praying to all the gods that this final campaign would succeed swiftly, with minimal bloodshed. And yet war rarely heeded prayers. She felt the familiar tension coil around her heart. Another gamble, another test. But if any house had proven it could thrive in adversity, it was House Stark. Spring's gentle breeze rustled the direwolf banners, whispering of renewal. The yard quieted, leaving only a residual hush. In her mind's eye, she pictured Robb at the head of the host, gray wind loping by his stirrup, the Great John pounding the earth with unstoppable vigor. They would cross muddy roads, pass farmland that still bore scars of earlier conflicts, then come upon the Dreadfort with righteous fury. If all went to plan, Bolton's last stronghold would fall and the North would stand united at last. She whispered a silent vow, let them triumph, let them return. Let the North truly know peace. A small voice inside reminded her that wars rarely ended so cleanly. But the older, fiercer part of her answered that if anyone could defy the odds, it was the same wolves who had turned Walder Frey's trap into his undoing, who had outmaneuvered Tywin, who had shattered Bolton's siege of Winterfell. Time and again, House Stark had proven itself too resolute to kill. Catelyn exhaled, stepping back into the keep, aware that her tasks did not end simply because the army had marched. Winterfell needed her guidance, the small folk needed direction, the realm might still hold surprises. Yet for the first time in months, she felt a distinct sense of forward motion. They were done waiting for danger to come. The king in the north was carrying the fight to the last betrayer, and with that, the north might finally heal. High above, crows wheeled over the towers, cawing in the bright sky. The southwestern wall stood firm, new mortar shining faintly. The gates clanked shut behind the departing soldiers, reminding her that she was, for the moment, a guardian of the seat while the king was away. She straightened her shoulders, summoning that quiet strength that had carried her through so many trials. Let Bolton's fortress quake. Let the final shadows of betrayal be banished. And so the days of waiting began anew, but this time with more hopeful hearts. The yard emptied each morning as chores were done with swift efficiency, men mindful that the real danger had marched east. At night, the great hall was subdued, people retiring early or speaking quietly about how the host might fare. Catelyn kept the fortress running, wrote to Edmure with updates, prayed in the godwood for Robb's success, and accepted what visitors came seeking counsel. She sometimes found Asha Greyjoy gazing from a tower window at the bleak horizon. No sign of mockery in her face now, only a kind of fascination at how the North conducted war. Then, on the 10th day after Robb's departure, horns blared at midday. Guards rushed to the walls, and Catelyn felt her heart jolt. Had the host returned so soon, or was it an enemy force? She hurried to the gatehouse. Through the swirling dust on the road, she made out riders wearing northern cloaks, though not the full host. A smaller group, perhaps outriders or scouts. The gates opened. In rode a man she recognized, Torrhen Karstark, nephew of the late Rickard Karstark, who had died in earlier tumult. Torrhen's face was grim, but he bore no immediate sign of disaster. He dismounted. "I bring word from the king in the north," he said, inclining his head to Catelyn. "He's reached the outskirts of the Dreadfort. The lesser houses around have pledged no support to Bolton, so he's holed up inside with a dwindling garrison. Your son says it looks promising for a siege that won't last long." Relief crashed through her. So soon? Did they meet no resistance on the road? "Some, my lady," Torrhen replied. "A few Bolton outriders tried to harass them, but the Great John scattered them. The main gate of the Dreadfort is closed. Roose holds it with perhaps a few hundred men. That won't stand long against our combined might. But the king must proceed carefully. Bolton might have traps or hidden paths. Already a few men died in skirmishes near the walls. The king wishes you to know all is well so far." A small crowd had gathered, letting out murmurs of relief. Catelyn closed her eyes briefly in thanks. "And you've been sent here for?" "Resupply," Torrhen answered. "The roads are better than we feared, but we need more fodder for the horses, more arrows, plus any rams or siege implements the blacksmiths can spare. The king believes we can end this quickly with a solid push. Also, he sends for a maester or two. There are wounded." Catelyn nodded, calling for stewards to ready what they could. The fortress had limited surplus, but she would spare all possible. She told Torrhen to rest overnight, gather goods, and depart at dawn with wagons. A hush of expectancy took hold. If Robb had cornered Bolton at last, the final confrontation was near. The war might find closure in the east, near the cursed halls of the Dreadfort. Men traded excited whispers. Would Bolton hold out for weeks, or would he surrender? That night, Catelyn gave Torrhen Karstark a seat of honor at the high table, plying him for more details. He said the Great John was in high spirits, that Manderley's men approached from the White Knife side, and the Mormonts marched from Bear Island roads. Bolton's watchers had vainly tried to slow them, but the North was too unified to be turned aside. So now the dread fort was surrounded by multiple columns. Bolton had fewer men than expected. Some died at Winterfell, others deserted. The final test was the fortress's formidable walls. "But your son is determined," Torrhen finished. "He leads with cunning, setting archers around, preparing siege engines. We might starve Bolton out, or scale the walls if needed." Catelyn felt a surge of pride and fear. Starving a castle was a grim business, but far less deadly for the attackers than a reckless assault. Robb had learned caution. Let Bolton taste the bitterness of the siege he once inflicted. Still, she ached at the suffering war brought. She prayed Bolton would see sense or that the end would come swiftly. At dawn, the wagons were loaded. Torrhen Karstark departed, leading a small train of carts carrying fresh arrows, some newly forged rams, sacks of oats, and 2 maesters to tend the wounded. Catelyn stood by the gate, wishing him speed and success, her cloak fluttering in the crisp breeze. With that, Winterfell once again settled into uneasy waiting, each day scanning the road for news. The wait was mercifully short. Barely a fortnight later, horns sounded again. Another party arrived, about a dozen riders, these wearing the Stark sigil openly. Catelyn, anxiety coiled in her chest, rushed to meet them. At their head was a knight of House Manderley, a middle-aged man named Ser Luther. He slid from the saddle, face bright with triumph. "My lady," he said, voice shaking with excitement. "I come from the Dreadfort. It is done." Her heart thumped. "Done? You mean?" He grinned broadly. "Bolton has fallen. The Dreadfort is yours." The king in the north triumphed. Cheers erupted in the courtyard. Soldiers, stable hands, even Asha Greyjoy's guards exhaled in wonder. Catelyn grabbed Ser Luther's arm, eyes brimming. "Tell me everything." They hurried into the great hall, where the man recounted the final act. The allied northern forces had converged on the Dreadfort from 3 directions, forming a ring. Bolton's men tried a few desperate sallies, but each was repelled. 2 siege towers were built in haste. Over a week, they battered the gate with rams, battered the walls with stones. Inside, Bolton's men starved and quarreled. Finally, a group of them mutinied, opening a postern gate in the night. The Greyjoy's troops poured in. In the ensuing chaos, Roose Bolton himself was cornered in the keep. He refused to yield, tried to slay one of Robb's guards, and was cut down, ending his line of betrayal once and for all. The flayed man's standard was torn from the ramparts and replaced with the direwolf. Catelyn's breath caught. "Bolton is dead?" "Dead indeed," Ser Luther confirmed. "Your son saw to it. The bastard of Bolton was not found, though rumor says he died earlier or fled. Many of Bolton's knights surrendered. The king in the north granted mercy to common soldiers, but lords complicit in atrocities will face justice." A swirl of relief, sorrow, and vindication coursed through Catelyn. Roose Bolton, who had threatened her family time and again, was gone. The north was free of that horror. Men in the hall burst into applause, roaring the king in the north's name. She felt tears slip down her cheeks. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Ned would have wanted justice carried out swiftly with minimal cruelty. Ser Luther also mentioned casualties. Some of the Greyjoy's men died in the assault, as did a handful of Manderleys, Umbers, and Glovers. But the victory was decisive. "The king will remain at the Dreadfort a short while, ensuring order. He asked me to ride ahead and bring you the news, and to say he'll return to Winterfell soon. The Dreadfort itself is subdued, its small folk relieved to see an end to Bolton's tyranny. Praise for the king in the north spread through Winterfell. The great hall bustled with celebration. People hugged each other, poured cups of ale. Some even proposed an impromptu feast from what stores they had. Catelyn joined them in weeping relief, though her mind also soared to what this meant for the future. The north truly united, no traitors left. Tywin might remain a southern threat, but at least here, In their homeland, House Stark reigned unchallenged. She could scarcely believe the war might lighten enough for them to consider the next steps in rescuing Sansa, finding Arya, or building alliances. After the initial burst of joy, she withdrew to a quiet corridor, letting the others revel. She needed a moment alone. Snowmelt dripped from the eaves, pooling at her feet. She clasped her hands to her chest, looking out a narrow window at the courtyard, where men shouted in triumph. Bolton was dead, his seat taken, the stain of that betrayal wiped away. She closed her eyes, envisioning Robb riding back through the gates, victorious. Another page in the long saga of House Stark, written in blood but also in unwavering resolve. She murmured a prayer for the men lost, for those wounded, for the families torn by war. Then she prayed for her missing children, that perhaps this justice might appease the gods enough to let them come home. Lastly, she thanked the old gods for sparing them thus far. So many times the Starks had danced on the edge of ruin, yet they had endured. Let that pattern hold. In the days that followed, pockets of celebration lingered, though men still tended daily chores. Word of the Dreadfort's fall reached the villages around Winterfell, prompting more refugees to come seeking the new stability. The southwestern wall repairs were finally truly done, so stonemasons tackled smaller tasks or lent help in the yard. Each sunrise brought further signs that the north was free at last from internal threats. A few older lords who had hesitated to join the muster now arrived, apologizing, vowing fealty to House Stark. Catelyn received them, albeit with a certain polite wariness. Better that they bend the knee now than cause trouble later. A week later, the king in the north returned, flanked by the great Jon, Dacy Mormont, and a retinue of triumphant knights. Their horses bore signs of hard travel. The people of Winterfell lined the courtyard to greet them with cheers. Catelyn stood near the steps, tears in her eyes as she watched Robb dismount. He looked as though he'd aged another year in the brief campaign. Soot smudged his cheeks and a bruise discolored one temple. But he was alive, gray wind trotting beside him. Their gazes locked. A wave of fierce love swelled in her chest. He strode to her, ignoring onlookers, and embraced her. The courtyard erupted in applause, the great Jon whooping. She felt his heart pounding through his armor. Then he stepped back, raising his voice so all might hear. The traitor Bolton is dead. The Dreadfort stands under Stark rule. The north is whole again. A thunderous cheer rose, echoing off the stones. The men banged shields. The women clapped. Children gaped in awe. For once, no clouds overshadowed the day. The sky blazed bright, as if blessing them with the promise of new beginnings. Later, in the great hall, filled with the swirl of victory, Catelyn found a quiet moment with her son. The hall bustled with men wanting to share news or request favors, but she pulled him aside near a brazier. He sank onto a bench, exhaustion creeping into his posture. Gray wind curled at his feet, muzzle resting on paws. "You did it," she said softly, tears shining. "You've reclaimed the north from every threat. Harrenhal, the twins, Riverrun, Moat Cailin, the siege here, now the Dreadfort. All undone by your hand." He looked at her, a ghost of a smile tugging his lips. "I had help, Mother. None of this was me alone. But yes, we ended Bolton's reign of terror." She placed a hand over his. "Your father would be proud." His gaze flickered with grief and longing, but also a fierce pride. "Perhaps now we can truly rebuild, gather our strength, then see if the Lannisters still dare challenge us. Or maybe find time to search for my sisters, for Bran and Rickon." He sighed. "So many tasks remain." She nodded. "But for tonight, rest. Let the men celebrate a well-earned victory. Tomorrow we'll plan the future. For once, we do so without a knife at our throat." He squeezed her hand, and she felt the tension in him slowly ease. Cheers thundered in the hall as the great Jon raised a cup, praising the king in the north yet again. Robb rose to accept the applause, drawing his mother with him. The sight of them, side by side, Stark and Tully blood united, swelled the crowd's cheers to a roar. Winterfell's battered walls resonated with that joy, as though exhaling at last. A small feast followed, modest by southern standards but lavish compared to the scarcity of the siege months. The storerooms yielded salted meats, turnips, onions, dried apples, and even some of the White Harbor beer. The men devoured it all with gusto. Asha Greyjoy was allowed to attend under guard, sipping her ale in moody silence. Now that Bolton was gone, her own predicament felt even stranger, but she made no moves. The Great John teased her, half daring her to fight. She simply smirked, saying she'd had her fill of pointless battles. None pressed the matter further. Robb eventually rose, raising a half-full cup of ale. The hall hushed, men turning, some leaning in to hear. He spoke simply but powerfully. We remember those we lost in this war, those who fell at Harrenhal, at the Twins, at Riverrun, here at Winterfell, and now at the Dread Fort. Their sacrifice keeps House Stark alive. We stand tonight as the free North, unbroken by betrayal or the might of any southern foe. Let this be a new dawn for our land. A roar of agreement shook the rafters. Men pounded tankards on the long tables. Some shouted, "The King in the North." Others chanted, "Winterfell. Winterfell." Catelyn watched with full heart, thinking how improbable this moment was, how close they had come to annihilation more than once. And yet here they stood, forging hope from ruin. She mouthed a silent thank you to whatever gods watched over them. In the days that followed, the returning soldiers found families, saw injuries treated, recounted the final struggle at the Dread Fort. Robb wrote letters to Edmure Tully and to White Harbor announcing the victory. The Great John boasted daily that the flayed man was extinct, for Bolton's line ended in dishonor. At last, House Stark reigned supreme in the north. Rebuilding efforts continued, buoyed by fresh confidence. When men cleared rubble or hammered new beams, they did so with a sense of unstoppable momentum. For a week or more, it seemed life at Winterfell glowed with a subdued peace none had felt in ages. No crossbow bolts pierced the night, no horns sounded for enemy approach. Under the watchful gaze of the old heart tree in the Godwood, Robb made plans to dispatch loyal captains to outlying regions, reasserting Stark authority. Some men pressed him to ride south eventually, to challenge the Lannisters while they reeled from internal strife. Others pleaded for caution, urging him to let the realm's wars devour themselves. He listened, nodding, though he gave no final decision. Even a king needed respite to weigh such grand choices. Through it all, Catelyn felt a gentle release of constant dread. She took up small tasks in the library salvage again, or walked the walls with only mild worry. She prayed for her missing children in a calmer spirit, hoping that with the war receding here, maybe news would find them or they would emerge. She also prayed for Sansa, imagining that her captivity might be looser if King's Landing was in chaos. Perhaps she was free, hidden somewhere. Let the gods be merciful. Yet the realm was not fully at peace. They heard scraps of rumor about the Iron Throne's latest fiascos, the raging unpredictability of Euron Greyjoy in the west, the uncertain stance of the Vale under Lady Lysa's reclusiveness. All that might matter one day. But for now, the North was truly the North again, restored to Stark rule from the neck to the gift. A hush of satisfaction pervaded the castle. One crisp sunrise, as Catelyn walked the yard, she came upon a stirring sight. Robb had begun training sessions with a handful of younger men, future knights or masters-at-arms, personally instructing them in swordplay. He moved with calm assurance, offering quiet corrections. In the old days, Ned had done much the same with Robb, Jon, even Theon. Now it was Robb carrying on that tradition. She paused to watch, tears pricking her eyes. War had taken so much from them, but it had also forged this unstoppable king who had saved the North from ruin. She prayed they might keep him, that the realm's storms would not claim him as it had so many others. Seeing her, he smiled and waved a quick greeting, then returned to guiding the novices. Grey Wind lay off to the side, head on paws, blinking in the sun. A sense of continuity threaded through the moment, father to son, scars to healing, the castle to new guardians. The North truly did remember, preserving what was good even in the face of endless trials. And so life pressed on, day by day, in a mosaic of simpler tasks and grand designs. Asha Greyjoy remained under watch, uncertain if she'd eventually be ransomed or offered freedom in exchange for an oath never to raid the North again. She seemed content enough not to cause trouble. The Great John and other lords talked of future expansions, better roads, alliances with the Riverlands. Scouts rode out each week, verifying that no threat lingered. Each time they returned with only small trifles. A wounded wolf found in the forest, a rumor of old bandits gone. The land, once drenched in blood, was slowly exhaling. At night, a hush of gratitude filled the great hall. Men told stories of how they survived the Red Wedding's near disaster, of Tywin's humiliating retreat at Riverrun, of how they overcame Harrenhal, Moat Cailin, and that final siege at Winterfell. Catelyn listened, letting each retelling ease her mind. House Stark had walked through the darkest fires and emerged. If that was not a sign of the gods' favor, she did not know what was. Yes, the war might flare again someday. The Lannisters might muster, or fresh betrayals might lurk. But for now, the North was whole, the rightful rulers in place. Perhaps this was how healing began. With battered walls mended stone by stone, with farmland replanted in the new season, with once desperate villagers returning to carve out a life in the castle's shadow, and with the king in the North, Robb Stark, forging a future in the name of his father's legacy. One evening, as Catelyn concluded a quiet stroll through the Godswood, she saw the heart tree's reflection in the hot spring pool, the carved face tinged red with sap. Snow no longer blanketed the trunk. Tiny buds of green sprouted along the ground. It struck her as a gentle omen. Winter might still cling to the air, but the North had turned a corner. From this vantage, victory was not just the absence of enemies at the gate, but the reaffirmation of life, of families, of all that House Stark had long protected. The wars had not shattered their identity, they had revealed it in full. She closed her eyes, remembering Ned's calm presence, imagining him standing here once more. She whispered, "We've come so far, my love. Your son is king, and he has safeguarded our home. We'll not lose it again." A soft breeze lifted her hair, and in that swirl, she could almost believe Ned whispered back, telling her that as long as the North remembered, the wolves of Winterfell would never die. Stepping away, she returned to the courtyard. Torches gleamed near the archways, the hustle of men winding down for the evening. Overhead, the direwolf banner rippled in a mild breeze. On the ramparts, Robb's watchers kept vigilant, but their faces were no longer knotted with dread. The broken pieces had been reassembled into a fortress that once again exuded strength. She let her hand rest on the newly rebuilt southwestern wall, feeling the firm stone. This was the testament to House Stark's unbreakable spirit, tested by betrayal at the Twins, by siege at Winterfell, by every cunning trap that might have spelled their end. Yet time and again, House Stark had not only survived, but turned those attempts into triumphs. She turned toward the great hall, where a welcoming glow spilled into the yard. Men were gathering for the evening meal, subdued laughter echoing. No more the frantic clang of armor that had defined winter nights under siege. The king's seat awaited Robb on the dais. Asha Greyjoy presumably would dine in her corner under watch. The great Jon would likely boast anew about the dread fort. Perhaps a fiddler would strike up a tune and men might dance in the shadows cast by flickering torches. It was not a perfect piece, but it was something more genuine than they had dared hope for many moons. Catelyn Stark drew a long breath of spring air, tasting the faint tang of melting snow. The vantage from the courtyard was the vantage of a woman who had lived through the realm's worst heartbreaks, her husband's unjust death, her children's scattering, her house's near extinction. Now, standing among these stones that had thrice been threatened by Theon Greyjoy, Walder Frey's betrayal, and Roose Bolton's siege, she felt the warmth of victory and the promise of a calmer future. House Stark had reclaimed all that was stolen, cast down every traitor, and proven that even in the darkest times, the bonds of family and honor could prevail. She walked through the doors where the great hall's light embraced her and found her seat near Robb, who looked up with a faint smile. Grey wind dozed at the base of the dais. A hush of simple contentment whispered through her soul. Tomorrow might bring fresh challenges, might beckon them south or into new conflicts, but for tonight, Winterfell was safe. The wolves had outlived every snare. That was no small thing. And as the first melodies of a harp drifted between the columns, Catelyn whispered silent thanks, letting the final remnants of fear slip away into the stone, replaced by a fragile but growing hope that, at long last, the North was truly free and House Stark, so close to ruin so many times, now stood triumphant, forging new life out of every betrayal turned to dust.